Chapter 459. Geor Chapter 432 The Death of a Man. 4. When Lantis's assault boats finally reached the beach, the rebel army defending the port area finally collapsed. Lantis's assault boats finally broke through the blockade at the estuary. The densely packed boats carrying Lantis's soldiers raised their swords and shields high up in the air. There were also archers. Without waiting for the boats to reach the shore, they jumped into the water and raised their crossbows to shoot at the rebel army on the shore. The crossbows came and went, but the rebel army on the shore who had fallen into chaos suffered more casualties. Once Lantis's men reached the shore, the battle for the port area officially came to an end. Gislund's guess was correct. The rebel army lacked the courage and determination to fight to the death. More importantly, the rebel army had no intention of dying here. They were not familiar with the coastal defense system of the port. After encountering the ambush, they instinctively resisted for a moment. Now that their officers had lost their courage, there was also Roer's team. Although there were not many of them, their quality could be considered elite. Thus, once the situation became chaotic, there was no way to clean it up. Lantis's army quickly split into a tight formation on the shore. Archers and soldiers with swords and shields lined up in formation. They stood firm and supported the increasing number of Lantis's soldiers who were coming ashore by boat. Standing on the bridge of the flagship, the Divine Walker, Gislund used his binoculars to look at the shore. The first wave of soldiers who had come ashore had already gained a firm foothold. They were still lining up in an orderly manner to support more people. This Lantis naval commander suddenly sighed. Sigh, they are too conservative. He then turned to look at the deputy general beside him. Who is leading the first wave of soldiers? The deputy general beside him retracted his binoculars and gave a relaxed smile. It's that fellow Lagan. It seems he did a good job. With the beach occupied, the battle below will be easy. Gislund shook his head and frowned. Lagan's courage is still too small. He is too cautious. Look, the soldiers on the shore have clearly collapsed. Since they have already come ashore, why are they still lining up on the beach and waiting for the reinforcements? Gather all our forces and charge forward with all our might. The defenders have already lost their courage. As long as we assume a charging posture, I'm afraid that they will immediately retreat. After all, it seemed that Lagan was getting on in years. Although he was reliable in doing things, he wasn't aggressive enough. Hey, we need to keep a heart that dares to take risks and gamble. Gislund pondered for a moment and said to the deputy general, note it down. After the war, remind me to transfer Lagan to the Navy headquarters. The deputy beside him had a complicated look on his face, but under Gislund's serious gaze, he could only lower his head and memorize it. Gislund's words determined the fate of a naval officer, but he took off the commander's sword from his waist and threw it to the guard beside him. Most of the soldiers walked to the deck and shouted, "Put down a small boat! I'll bring my men ashore first." As soon as he spoke, the expressions of the deputy generals beside him changed. Someone stopped him and said, "Sir, the battle on the beach hasn't ended yet. It won't be too late for you to take command after the second wave of troops has gone up." Ha! Lagan was too cowardly. By the time the second wave goes up, I'm afraid the sky will be bright. At this moment, every moment is as precious as gold. Put down the boat. Seeing that the people around him still wanted to stop him, Gislund finally glared and shouted. Lantis's first wave of troops only had 2,000 to 3,000 people. While they were still on the shore according to the usual practice of landing operations, they were still obediently lined up to receive the follow-up troops. The second wave of troops had yet to come up. The fleet's troop carriers had just sailed into the estuary, and the small boats had yet to be put down. Gislund, with no more than 20 guards and a few deputy generals, took a small boat and directly left the flagship to land. Lantis's navy commander had sharp eyes and a keen grasp of the timing of the war. As soon as he went ashore, He immediately took over the command without hesitation. He ordered the first wave of troops that had already landed not to line up and wait on the spot. The entire army immediately divided into several battalions and charged toward the port area in several directions. At this time, Lantis's troops actually didn't have enough troops on the shore. They only had 2,000 to 3,000 people, and the number of rebels in the port area was probably several times that of Lantis's first wave of troops. There was also a large number of coastal defense systems in hand. If they had competent command and the determination to resist, it would be a joke for these 2,000 to 3,000 people to seize the port area in one go. If they encountered a countercharge from the defenders, they would probably be able to drive these 2,000 to 3,000 people into the sea. Even if they lacked the courage to countercharge, as long as they defended the arrow towers, these 2,000 to 3,000 people definitely wouldn't have the ability to seize the tight and deep coastal defense system. If they were to waste time, these 2,000 to 3,000 people would bleed dry on the beach. However, Gisland made the right bet. The 2,000 to 3,000 people that had landed rashly launched a charge. Once they rushed up, they were like a hot knife through butter. The defenders of the port area didn't have the slightest intention to resist. Seeing Lantis's troops rushing up with swords and shields, the defenders hurriedly fired a few arrows and began to retreat. At the beginning, they only retreated in 2s and 3s. Eventually, it evolved into a retreat in groups. Once someone took the lead, how could the others be willing to fight to the death? The arrow towers on the coast were originally the strongest fortifications. If the defenders were to take them head-on, even if Lantis's troops could take them down, who knows how many lives would be lost. But once they launched a charge, they discovered that the defenders in the arrow towers hurriedly withdrew from them. Then, like a swarm of bees, they ran madly towards the city. Some of them were in a hurry and even threw away the armor and crossbows on their bodies. Several groups of people rushed over and seized 6 or 7 arrow towers in one breath. Surprisingly, not a single person died. Lantis's troops didn't even need to fire a single arrow to take down almost all the arrow towers around the landing beach. Gisland was even more thorough. He even ordered that no one should be left behind to guard the arrow towers that had been seized. The whole army just blindly charged forward. A laughable and absurd situation suddenly took place in the harbor area. There were no more than 2,000 to 3,000 troops, but they were chasing after the scattered defenders, who were several times their number. Gradually, the defenders converged into one force, and ran madly towards the city in defeat. On the dock, the direction of the warehouse was still filled with flames. On the coast, Lantis's fleet had already driven straight in. In less than an hour, Gisland had almost completely occupied the whole area of the port area. The defenders were completely expelled by him. Finally, Gisland saw Fatso and Roer, who were already covered in blood, under an arrow tower. There were less than 30 people left with Roer. These elites were all seriously injured, and some of them were so tired that they sat on the ground. Seeing the arrival of Lantis men, they could only lean against the wall and gasp for breath. Roer had a saber in his hand, and the blade was mottled with countless dents. The set of armor on his body was also damaged in many places. His chubby face was covered in blood, and even his original appearance could not be seen. Fatso's shoulder was cut open by a saber, and blood kept flowing out. But seeing Gisland rushing over with his men, Fatso immediately threw away the saber in his hand and shouted, "We're on the same side! We're on the same side!" Gisland rushed to the front and saw Fatso's appearance clearly. He finally took a deep breath and said with a smile, "I guessed that there was a spy on the shore. It really is you. Roer, if you weren't here, I'm afraid I would have to fight hard until dawn before I could go ashore." Looking at Roer, who had just thrown his saber to the ground, Gisland frowned and said, "What do you mean by that?" Roer smiled and squinted at the bearded General Lantis in front of him. He said indifferently, "You're very cunning. Others don't understand you. Back in the Imperial Military Academy, I fought with you hundreds of times. How could Lao Tzu not understand you? If I hadn't thrown away my saber early and loudly declared my identity, maybe you would have taken advantage of the chaos to kill Lao Tzu. Humph, if I died in your hands in the chaos, where would Lao Tzu go to cry out for justice? After that, you would just spread your hands and say it was an accident. Gislin's expression changed and he looked at Roer. Both of them laughed dryly. Roer then said, "The dock is already yours, Gisland. Now, outside the city there are at least 100,000 rebels." Now, Gisland did not hesitate. "Of course, there's no need to ask now. I'll immediately bring my men into the city, and go straight to the palace. As long as your country's palace is not broken and His Majesty is still alive, this war can still be fought." Roer sighed and nodded. However, the way he looked at Gisland became more and more gloomy. Go straight to the palace, humph. Although Gisland had the heart to gamble, he was not a fool. This time, he did not dare to directly bring more than 2,000 people into the city. The city was full of rebels. If these few people entered, they would be swallowed up in the blink of an eye. He patiently urged his subordinates to pass on the order. After more than an hour, the second wave of troops finally came ashore. With tens of thousands of troops gathered, Gisland immediately brought his men out of the port area and rushed all the way to the palace. The city was in chaos again. The battle in the port area lasted for half the night. Then, the defenders of the port area retreated. The news that Lantis's army had landed on the shore and occupied the dock kept spreading. After the fall of the city, the rebel army had divided the originally huge Ashilia into areas of influence. The various rebel armies occupied the different streets of the city, plundering and pillaging to their heart's content. Once Gisland led his men and rushed out of the port area without stopping, the rebel army in the city did not even have time to come up with a strategy to resist. The rebel army was fighting for themselves. Gisland did not have the intention to really occupy the whole city of Asgalia. He personally led a team of less than 10,000 people and rushed in the direction of the palace. If the rebel army along the way stopped him, he naturally did not hesitate to fight and rush. However, if the rebel army along the way did not stop him, he also led his men and rushed through, not even interested in looking at them. In this situation, he was obviously going to the palace to risk his life. Whoever fought with him would be stupid. Along the way, only two groups of rebel army put up a little resistance. However, under the charging footsteps of Lantis's men, they were quickly crushed. The rest of the rebel army simply stood still and did not have the intention to go up and block them. At this time, there was no prestigious commander in the rebel army who could suppress the other groups. There was also no strategy that was unanimously approved by everyone. Everyone was so chaotic. Lantis's men rushed all the way to the palace. It was so smooth that even Gisland himself was shocked. These Byzantium rebels. Were they all brainless? Outside the palace, there was a mountain of corpses and a sea of blood. In the middle of the night, Hughes crazily urged the troops to attack overnight. The port area was full of fighting, and the governor's face became more and more ugly. In the end, if it were not for his subordinates desperately trying to stop him, the governor would have put on his armor and rushed forward himself. Since their commander was so furious, his subordinates had no choice but to fight with all their might. One by one, the emblem groups were sent forward. Although the square outside the palace gates of the palace was wide and grand, it was still a palace and could not be compared to a real city. In such a small place, no matter how many troops there were, they would not be able to spread out. They could only send one emblem group after another to fight. The defense of the palace had always been tight. In addition, the defenders knew that they were at the end of their rope. If the palace was breached, they would really die. It was death either way, so they might as well fight to the death. Killing one more rebel army would mean dragging one more down with them. Moreover, the emperor himself had personally boosted morale. In addition, the defenders had fought bravely and bravely. The main general, General Span, was fully equipped and armed. He fought side by side with the soldiers against the enemy. After days of bitter defense, they finally made it through. Tonight, the rebel army had suddenly gone crazy and fought with all their might. However, the defenders also knew about the movements in the port area. After fighting for many days, they finally saw some hope. Everyone mustered their last bit of courage. The rebel army used their lives to fill the gap, but the defenders also used their lives. After fighting for the past few days, the defenders had suffered heavy losses. Even Emperor Garcia's personal bodyguards had donned their armor and gone up the city walls to fight. Some of the palace servants who were strong and healthy had also been given weapons and armor to go up the city walls to fight. The rebel army launched another 4 or 5 attacks in the night. Under Hughes's desperate and reckless madness, he even seized a section of the palace walls once and almost took down the main gate of the palace. In the end, General Span personally led a few officers and rushed up to block the gap. In the end, a few of Span's deputies died in battle. Only then did they manage to chase the rebel army down. This was the most dangerous time, but it was also the last time. After several continuous attacks, the rebel army was finally exhausted. No matter how much Hughes was stomping his feet or vomiting blood at the back, the troops could not continue to attack. After days of bloody battles, after entering the city, the other families were all fighting to make a fortune. Only his own troops were still crying and fighting. They had already accumulated too much dissatisfaction. After days of continuous casualties, they continued to fight day and night. The soldiers had done their best. At that moment, if Hughes were to force them back, the next step would likely incite a mutiny. After the last attack was chased back, Hughes tilted his head and heard the sounds of battle coming from the port area. He also heard the sounds of the ballistic cannons firing. Unknowingly, those sounds had stopped. The face of the rebel army's governor, which had been flushed red, suddenly turned pale. His body swayed as he looked at the imperial city before him. Up and down the square, there were corpses lying on the ground. Broken armors and swords were strewn all over the square, and a thick layer of blood had accumulated on the square. In such a cold weather, a layer of blood had accumulated on the square. No matter how cold the air was, it was incapable of suppressing the thick stench of blood. I did my best. I really did my best. Hughes suddenly let out a bitter laugh. He opened his mouth, and a mouthful of blood flowed out from his mouth. His body swayed again. Someone beside him had already come forward to support him. "Sir," Hughes gave a harumph and wanted to say something. However, the moment he opened his mouth, another mouthful of blood flowed out. His face turned even paler. "Sir." One of his trusted subordinates beside him had tears in his eyes. "I will personally lead my men up there. If I cannot take down the palace gate, I would rather die on the gate." After saying that, the general was about to turn around. However, Hughes, who was behind him, suddenly opened his mouth. Although his voice was not loud, it was very resolute. "Stop." The general turned around to see Hughes smiling bitterly. He shook his head and said in a low voice, "No need, the opportunity has passed." He struggled to stand up. Then, using an extremely strange tone, he slowly said, "Pass down the order, retreat. We will retreat, leave this place." "Sir, we will retreat, retreat to where?" Some of his subordinates were puzzled. The entire territory of this city had been divided up by the other rebel armies. Their own army, if they were to retreat, where would they retreat to? Where? Hughes suddenly smiled again. However, his eyes were even uglier in this smile. Finally, he gritted his teeth and squeezed out these words from his mouth. "We will leave the city." As soon as these words came out, it immediately shocked his subordinate. Someone shouted, "Sir, we risked our lives to break into the city. How can we go out now?" Even if the territory has been divided up by other families, with our strength, no one will give in to us. Even if Lantis and his men enter the city, we have dozens of rebel armies. We are not afraid. Osculia City, how can we give it away so easily? Shut up. Hughes's eyes were red. He finally shook his head. You don't understand. If we can't take down the palace, this city is no longer ours. He suddenly clenched his fist. Hateful. Those who conspired with me are a bunch of short-sighted clowns. If it weren't for their stupidity and short-sightedness, how could such a good situation be ruined like this? Ridiculous. In this history book, Hughes, will finally be a laughingstock. He was already in despair. He shouted, "Gather the entire army. Leave the city. Leave the city. Let those idiots fight with Lantis and his men in the city. If we don't leave now, it will be too late. I'm afraid we won't be able to leave even if we want to." The Armenian rebel army had received the order to retreat. The entire army was already tired of the war. Once they received the order, they immediately left the square of the imperial city in waves. Hughes did not waste any time and directly led his men to the northeast of the city. On the way, they met Salvatore's army. They had originally planned to join forces with Hughes to attack the palace. Seeing that Hughes had already retreated, how could Salvatore not know the situation? Without any hesitation, he immediately ordered all of his troops to slowly head northeast with Hughes's troops, leaving the city that very night. They retreated? Gislin's troops had already rushed to less than 2 blocks away from the palace. The vanguard troops in front of them had already sent back news. They only said that the rebel army under the palace had already gathered and retreated long before their troops came up. They lined up and left slowly. When Lantis's vanguard troops arrived at the palace, the retreating rear of the rebel army was already within sight. However, the rebel army did not seem to have any intention of fighting. They just put on a tight defensive posture and slowly retreated. Corpses were everywhere in the square outside the imperial palace. The houses and buildings outside the square were almost all demolished. The stones were used to make battering rams and stone throwers during the siege. Everywhere was a mess of ruins. When Lantis's vanguard troops arrived at the square, they only saw the Byzantine Empire's imperial flag and eagle flag on the palace gate. It's good that they left. After carefully savoring the news that had been sent over, Gislund immediately calmed down after a brief moment of surprise. He even stroked his beard and whispered, "Hughes is no fool. He can see the situation clearly. This person can be considered a bachelor. He knows that he has lost, so he doesn't want to get tangled up in it. He left without hesitation. Hey!" However, the person who came to report said, "My lord, there is only one thing. What is it?" The face of the officer who sent the news was somewhat gloomy. "Our vanguard troops have already arrived outside the palace. The enemy troops have already been eliminated. However, the palace gate is still closed. Our men went up, but the other side refused to open the palace gate. Moreover, our men are not allowed to get close to the palace wall. The guards on the wall are very vigilant. They have never put down their swords, weapons, and bows. When we tried to get close, the other side would shoot arrows to warn us. My lord, these Byzantium people." When Gislund heard that, he suddenly revealed a strange smile. He looked at the officer and said indifferently, "There is nothing strange about it. At this time, how could the Byzantium people dare to open the palace gate and let us in? Humph! They only have one last thing left, the emperor. If they open the gate, we will take the opportunity to kill our way in and kidnap the emperor." His eyes suddenly lit up and he could not help but whisper to himself, "If it is true." Gislund abruptly raised his head. His face was extremely solemn. He stared at his subordinate and said, "Look at the guards on the palace wall. If we charge forward, do you think we can break through the gate and enter the palace within a quarter of an hour? To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www. Chidian. Calm, there are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 460. GOR Chapter 432 The Death of a Man. 5. The subordinate's expression also changed. When he raised his head, he saw his commander-in-chief staring at him with a pair of bright eyes. The officer steeled his heart and immediately understood. A glimmer of light flashed in his eyes. Just as he was about to answer, "Sir, an army bearing the Byzantium flag is heading toward us. There are over 2,000 of them." The sudden report from the front dispelled the last thought in Gislin's mind. He frowned and looked into the distance. At the end of the street square, a Byzantine army was slowly approaching. The entire army was brimming with killing intent, and they were on high alert. Their bowstrings were not retracted and swords were in their hands. They assumed a fighting stance, and the entire army slowly advanced along the street. Only when the two sides were about to come into contact did the other side raise their flag. A black horse slowly mounted, and a burly figure rode on it. From afar, a hoarse and familiar voice could be heard. "Audiobook of the Byzantine Empire is here. You are Lantis allies. May I ask who is leading them?" Hearing that, Gislind sighed inwardly. What a pity! Why did this fellow come in such a hurry? I missed the opportunity. He immediately pulled himself together and strode forward. Laughing loudly, he said, "Audiobook? You really didn't die." After saying that, he whispered to the subordinate beside him, who had a murderous look on his face. Sighing softly, he smiled and said, "Forget it. A missed opportunity is a missed opportunity. I didn't expect this scarred face to come so quickly. He. The heavens have not given up on the Byzantium." Shaking his head, Gislind stepped forward and strode to the front of the army. At this moment, in the square outside the imperial palace, Lantis troops were lined up at the intersection of a street. Across the square was the Byzantium army. Audiobook was sitting on the warhorse. He had been seriously injured for a long time, and the days of suffering had probably squeezed out the last bit of energy in his body. Although the Lantis reinforcements that he had been looking forward to for many days had finally arrived, Audoric's expression and eyes were even more nervous and solemn than before. Even though there were many injuries all over his body that caused his eyes to darken, he was still sitting upright on the horse's back. Even his back was still straight. Behind him, of course, were the elites that he had brought from the Arc de Triomphe. After days of bloody battles, when Salvador finally retreated with his men, almost all of the soldiers guarding the Arc de Triomphe had been killed. More than half of the 7,000 to 8,000 soldiers had been killed or injured. In the era of cold weapons, this kind of casualty ratio should have caused the army to collapse long ago. The only reason they were able to hold on until now was because of Salvador, the last famous general of the empire. Once Salvador retreated, Audiobook didn't relax. He immediately realized that the current situation had become even more sensitive, delicate, and dangerous. He didn't hesitate to order the entire army to leap out of the camp and entangle Salvador's troops the entire way. First of all, he naturally wanted to buy time at the last moment to prevent Salvador from joining forces with Hughes and making a last stand. Second of all, he couldn't tell anyone what he had in mind. The Imperial Palace. He had to rush to the Imperial Palace as soon as possible. Although Lantis troops were reinforcements, this kind of ally might not be reliable. Right now, the Byzantine Empire was already at the end of the road. It was hard to guarantee that these allies wouldn't have any thoughts of killing them. The remaining troops behind him had been fighting hard for days. Hunger, thirst, fatigue, and injuries had almost crushed them to the brink of collapse. However, Audiobook still forcefully pulled his troops out and fought with Salvador's troops along the way. Then, they rushed to the palace by risking their lives. Sure enough, they arrived at the same time as Lantis' troop, and the misgivings in his heart were indeed not without reason. Audiobook himself did not know that if he had come a moment later, Gislind who was opposite him, might have really developed some thoughts. The people that Adrik brought along had been fighting hard for many days. At this moment, the 2,000 soldiers behind him were still in formation on the long street. Their bowstrings were drawn, and swords were in their hands. It was obvious that they were ready to fight to the death at any time. However, this was done deliberately by Adrik. With so many soldiers under his command, naturally, no one really doubted Adrik's intentions. Even though the rebel army had already retreated, he still ordered the entire army to be in such a vigilant posture. Most people only thought that the commander was doing this to prevent the possibility of the rebel army's counterattack. Even if there were a few who were more quick-witted and sharper, they naturally wouldn't say this out loud in public. Gisland stood in the distance, looking at Adrik himself and the soldiers behind him. With Gisland's military experience, it was not difficult for him to see that the Byzantine army opposite him was almost at the end of the road. From the soldiers to the generals, all of them were covered in wounds. The soldiers were exhausted, and they suffered heavy casualties. Their armor was disheveled, and their flags were damaged. Everyone looked exhausted, and their bodies were covered in blood. However, they were still able to maintain a vigilant posture and get into formation. Even Adrik in front of him, Gisland could see the weakness of the other party at a glance. No matter how hard Adrik tried to stay alert, the injuries on his body couldn't be compared to the injuries of a smart person like Gisland. For a moment, even Gisland himself was shaken. Right now, Adrik is at his weakest. The remnants of the army behind him have already squeezed out all of their energy. They look crooked and weak, and I fear that they will collapse with a light poke. If I suddenly launch a surprise attack at this time, perhaps with just one charge, I will be able to completely annihilate the enemy army, perhaps, just one charge, perhaps. Such a great temptation was enough to make a commander like Gisland's heart beat faster and his mouth dry up. Defeating Adrik's army in one fell swoop, killing the pillar of the Byzantine Empire, killing Adrik, a famous general who could leave a place in the history books, and securing the capital of a country. Then, as long as he commanded his army to attack, the already crumbling palace gates wouldn't be able to stop the elites of the Lantis behind him. Then, the emperor in the palace would be firmly in his hands, executing the most famous general of a country, conquering the capital of a country, and capturing the emperor of a country alive. With such great contributions, his name would probably be recorded in the history book. Even after 100 or 1,000 years, the world would never forget the names of Gisland and Son of Storm. In the hundreds of years of history of the Lantis kingdom, except for the founding fathers of the country, there was probably no one else who could compare to him in military exploits. Perhaps all he needed to do was to harden his heart and make a decision. Perhaps he only needed to charge. With such a great temptation, Gisland's eyes really wavered for a moment, until Adrik, who was sitting on the horse opposite him, seemed to have noticed the strange silence of this son of the storm, and immediately shot a sharp gaze at him. It really is tempting. Gisland licked his lips and took a deep breath. His eyes finally regained their clarity. The temptation was indeed great, but he couldn't move. He really couldn't move. Kill Adrik, destroy the remnants of the army in front of him, and then lead the army into the palace. Perhaps he could really do it with the strength in his hands right now. But what about after that? There were still more than 100,000 rebels inside and outside the city. If he really did that, Salvatore and Hughes would probably be laughing so hard that they wouldn't be able to close their mouth. If he fell out with the Byzantine Empire at this moment, then his entire strategy would be ruined. The law that Lantis used to send out troops would no longer exist. Let's not talk about whether he could capture Emperor Garcia. Even if he did, he wouldn't be able to use this method to control the remnants of the Byzantine Empire. At that time, without the banner of the emperor, the local forces in Byzantium would completely collapse, turning into a pile of loose sand. It wouldn't be beneficial to him at all. The only ones who would be able to make a difference would be those rebels. In the end, Lantis' side was still an outsider. Unless Lantis made up his mind and took the stance of an all-out war, mobilized the entire country, and pulled out all the troops. He made up his mind and used the strength of the entire country to fight a war with the goal of completely destroying the Byzantine Empire, but could he really afford to fight now? Byzantium now had rebels inside and Odin outside. If he really destroyed the royal family, it would be impossible for his side to swallow such an empire. Gisland was very clear that from top to bottom, the conclusion of this war had already been reached. It was impossible to swallow the entire empire in one go. The only purpose of his country participating in this war was to obtain enough benefits. But this was on the premise that the royal family of the Byzantine Empire continued to exist. Gently, Gisland unconsciously loosened his tightly clenched fist. Then, he exhaled, as if the fire that had just risen in his heart had all been expelled. Finally, a smile appeared on his face again. He quickly ran to the front and opened his arms, indicating that he wasn't holding a sword in his hands. Facing Adrik's sharp gaze, Gisland laughed loudly. "Hey, Scarface, I led the army here. You made yourself look so murderous. Is this how you welcome your allies? Ha 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 ha." After saying that, he left the group behind him without hesitation and walked to the square. Opposite, Adrik sat on horseback and watched Gisland finally come out. The general finally breathed a sigh of relief. Gisland, after all, is still Gisland. If it was a short-sighted guy, I'm afraid it would really be dangerous. Adrik snorted. He didn't urge his horse forward because the warhorse he was riding on probably couldn't even run a few steps at this moment. The Imperial City Guard is here again. I have led the troops to protect His Majesty the Emperor. Sir Gisland, since you are a guest army, please step back a little and don't offend the Imperial City. Adrik threw these two words coldly. These words were very rude, but the smile on Gisland's face did not diminish at all. He immediately turned his head and deliberately shouted in a voice that could be heard on the other side. "Pass down the order, all troops retreat 200 steps. Leave this street. Without my order, no one is allowed to set foot in the square." Lantis' men silently lined up and retreated. Gisland, who was laughing with a face full of laughter, did not have the intention to come forward and talk. He just turned his head and left. Before he left, he cast a meaningful look and seemed to throw a sentence over from a distance. "Adrik, Your Excellency has fought hard for the country this time. The capital can survive because of Your Excellency's great achievement. After the war, you will be rewarded according to your merits. I'm afraid that you will be the leader of the Byzantine army in the future. Once again, I congratulate Your Excellency." In the face of such words, Adrik did not make any expression. He just looked at the other side coldly and watched the black mass of Lantis troops completely withdraw from the street, leaving only a few dozen sentries on the street far away. Adrik then turned over and dismounted from his horse. Two guards beside him came up to support him in a hidden position. The general, who had always been unyielding, did not refuse again. He was almost unable to even walk. More than 2,000 remnants of the army came forward and occupied the square in front of the palace. Hughes took his men and left very straightforwardly. He did not even pack up the tents and camps left behind before. 2,000 people hastily set up camp around the square, still in a state of full alert. It was only at this time that the gate of the palace that was mottled with blood and fire finally opened slowly. Several generals covered in blood took the lead. He held an imperial eagle flag in his hand and stepped out. From afar, he saw Adrik's figure. That general suddenly knelt down. When he raised his head, his face was already covered in blood. His forehead was wrapped in gauze, and one of his eyes was also wrapped up. Adrik was supported to the front. The eyes of the general kneeling on the ground suddenly flowed with tears. The tears mixed with the blood on his face and rolled down. "General!" We defended. Adrik recognized this person. He was one of the flag bearers of the city guard army. He was usually a valiant general. At this moment, he was clearly blind in one eye. As he knelt there, his body could not stop trembling. Adrik took a deep breath and looked at this person. He said in a low voice, "Where is Span?" No answer. The several people before him were all deathly silent. When Adrik saw General Span, the general was sitting on top of the palace tower. He was holding a knife in his hand. He was holding it so tightly that his knuckles were white. Span's lips were slightly open. He was sitting on the ground, his back leaning against the wall. The blood on his body had yet to dry. The armor on his chest had been torn open and his flesh was badly mangled. There was no more blood on his face. He must have wiped it clean. His eyes were open, unwilling to close. Span was dead. His death was absolute. His death was very tragic. They had endured through the most difficult period and were about to see the light of dawn. However, he died. He died at the very last moment before dawn. Adrik stood before Span's corpse and quietly looked at his colleague. He looked at this general of the empire who had fought side by side with him for half a year. He looked at this middle-aged man who had accomplished nothing in the past. However, in this war to protect the empire, he bravely stepped forward and turned the tide. Beside him, some of the officers of the city guard army were sobbing quietly. Some were silent. Only the officer who had lost an eye spoke in a low voice. "If you had come earlier, you might have been able to see Lord Span for the last time." The rebel army charged at the city gate. In the end, they went berserk. We fought bitterly for many days. Our brothers could no longer hold on and were scattered. Seeing that the city gate was about to be lost, Lord Span led several officers to charge forward and block the gap. Lord Span's body was already weak these days. Yesterday, he was hit by an arrow. The arrow only hit his shoulder and he lost a lot of blood. At that time, we could not hold on anymore. Those rebel soldiers were all elites who dared to die. Lord Span led us to block them. After a chaotic battle, more than half of our men died. However, in the end, we were able to push them back down. However, when the enemy retreated, I saw Lord Span sit down and lean against the wall. Lord Span has never been willing to show any signs of fatigue in front of others. Even if he was heavily injured, as long as he was in front of the soldiers, he would straighten his back. He would not even frown. When I saw Lord Span suddenly sit down, I had a thought. Not good. Lord Span's chest was hit by the rebel army's elites with a mace. His armor was already broken and his body was weak. He was unable to take that hit. When we ran to his side, Lord Span was still conscious. However, he could no longer raise his hand. The armor on his chest was broken and there was a deep dent in his ribs. I fear that his ribs were broken and pierced into his lungs. No matter how much we cried, Lord Span's face remained normal. However, blood kept flowing out from his mouth. As the military officer spoke, he was already sobbing. He clenched his fists and knelt before Span's corpse. His voice was trembling. He was clearly a valiant man. However, he was crying like a child. Adrik's eyes were also red. However, he only took a deep breath. In the end, the tears in his eyes did not flow out. After a moment of silence, Adrik said in a low voice, Did he leave any words behind?" "Words." The military officer raised his head and looked at Adrik. Then, he said in a low voice, "There was only one sentence. Before Lord Span died, he looked at us and kept muttering one sentence." "What?" Lord Span said, "Blow the horn. Let them hear our horn. Let them know that we are still here. The imperial city is still here. Blow the trumpet. Blow the trumpet." Adaric's face was gloomy as he softly muttered these words. Finally, he couldn't hold it in any longer. Hot tears rolled down his face as a glimmer of light appeared in his eyes. Wu Ran turned around and looked at the troops behind him. He shouted, "Men, pass the order." "Yes, Lord." A subordinate immediately stepped forward. "Pass the order. Blow the horn. Blow the triumphant return. It's New Year's Eve. When I update, my mood is as cold as the winter. I know that my work has not been good recently. It's extremely bad. However, the pressure from the situation has made me unable to hold on. Before I was sick. Now that I've recovered, something happened at home. Today is New Year's Eve. When I update this chapter, I just came back from the hospital. My father has a heart problem and is currently in the hospital for treatment. Today is New Year's Eve. At noon, he went through the procedures to be discharged so that he can return home for New Year's. I carefully listened to the doctor's instructions. However, my heart did not feel good. It's New Year's Eve, but I don't have the slightest bit of joy in my heart. Last night, when I was accompanying my father in the hospital, I saw him sleeping soundly on the bed. I felt like I was willing to use everything I had to exchange for my father's health. Unfortunately, I know that I can't do it. My father is sick. I am the only child, so the family has to rely on me. In the hospital, in front of my mother, I have to maintain a smile. I can't have a gloomy expression. At this time, if I appear too pessimistic or gloomy, it will make them even more worried. I have to put on a "don't worry, it's not a big deal" expression to make my father and mother feel at ease. It's New Year's Eve. As usual, I should say a few auspicious words to everyone. Here, I won't say anything else. I just want to say, I wish all my brothers and sisters the best of health. Yes, good health. Recently, I feel more and more that health is the most important thing. Everyone, please take care of your health. Xiao Wu, to be continued. If you want to know the future, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 461. Some of the words were written at the end. GOR Chapter 433 Breaking Out of the Cage, Part 1, Dusk. The days during winter were short and the sky turned dark early. Accompanied by the cold winds, the sound of the bugle could be heard coming from far away from the city walls. This was a time of chaos in the northern part of the empire. Be it in the open or in the dark, everyone knew that the fate of this country had come to an end. Everyone also knew that in this chaotic world, being able to survive was already a great fortune. Amidst the suffering, there was nothing more to ask for. However, there was still peace in this small city. There were still troops stationed in the city. Furthermore, the lord who was promoted from mayor to county governor, before finally being addressed as marshal, seemed to be quite popular among the troops. For Denzel City to not be engulfed by the chaos of war and to be able to live out the rest of the year in peace was a rare occurrence in these troubled times. That was especially true every day. Once in the morning and once in the evening, the sound of the bugle horn could be heard coming from the military camp outside the city. This was a familiar bugle horn. In the beginning, some people found it noisy. However, as time passed, they gradually got used to it. Instead, they felt that being able to hear the bugle horn of the military camp outside the city had become a form of comfort. At the very least, there were still some soldiers stationed outside the city. This piece of land was also protected by people. That was a sign of safety. Sir Shea appeared to be a man of great ability. It was said that he had once served in the Roadrear Cavalry and made a great contribution. He had received the recognition of the Emperor, and the military was also a blessing to him. In the past year, he was able to gather up so many soldiers and defeat the vicious men of Odin. Everyone could see with their own eyes that the military forces surrounding Denzel City were growing stronger day by day. Could even be said that the military forces there were strong and powerful. Additionally, there was also the control of public opinion. There was also the great wizard in white Todoro, who had recently become famous. This place seemed to have become the safest place in the entire northern part of the empire. It was said that in the south, Ilton County had been ravaged by the Odin. The land had been occupied, the city had been destroyed, and the villages and towns had been burned down. Any man who dared to resist had been slaughtered. The remaining men had been enslaved, and the women had been ravaged by the barbaric Odin. In this winter, it was said that in order to save food, the Odin in the south had slaughtered and buried large batches of the old and weak. All sorts of frightening legends made the tranquility of this small piece of land in the north of even more precious in these troubled times. Every day, when they saw the soldiers patrolling the city, the commoners would look at them with gratitude and respect. The sound of the horn outside the city was distant and solemn. However, the sound gradually died down. This was the last drill before sunset in the barracks outside the city. After the bugle call ended, the gates of Denzel City would be closed and a curfew would be imposed. It was a time of war. As the rear of the army, Denzel City had naturally raised its level of security by several levels. As Shea's base, the barracks outside Denzel City housed the 2nd Division of the Northern War Zone. This division was far from being as elite as the 1st Division. Be it in terms of equipment or training, they were barely up to par. Most of them were new recruit. Additionally, there was also a shortage of supplies. It must be known that the territory in Shea's hands was only the size of Moore Prefecture. Almost all of the financial resources in his hands had been squeezed out. Relying on such a small area, to support the military strength of 2 corps, if it was a normal day, it would have long been overwhelmed, and the only result would be collapse. Fortunately, they had the support of the gold from the Zakuta people. Additionally, during this time of war, Shea had not hesitated to implement a rationing system. He had collected almost all the supplies, food, ironware, and handed them over to the public for distribution. Although this order was somewhat cruel, during this period of time, the commoners had quietly endured it. After all, everyone knew that in these troubled times, being able to survive was already a great fortune. Although this Lord Marshal was somewhat ruthless in his demands for money and food, the reason he was able to form such an army was so that he could have the ability to protect himself. Thus, despite the bitter days, they were able to endure it. In order to create military equipment, almost all the ironware had been collected. During the collection process, kitchen knives, iron pots and the like from the commoners' homes were also included in the list of items to be collected. At present, the scene of several families gathering together to share a pot for cooking could be seen everywhere in the city. It was said that in order to gather ironware, even the wrapping iron on the main gate of the county governor's mansion had been stripped. If this were during times of peace, this would be considered a military exercise. However, in times like this, there was no other choice. They had to endure it silently. Their days could be a little more bitter. They could make do with some food. They could choose not to use ironware and save some food to supply the army. As long as they could ensure their safety, that would be enough. At the very least, living in Denzel City, they would have food in their pots and a roof over their heads. It was better than living in Ilton County in the south, which was occupied by Odin's people. The men were reduced to slaves or wandering ghosts, the women were ravaged by Odin's barbarians and the old and weak were massacred. Those were tens of thousands of times better. After the last bugle call ended, the city gates of Denzel City slowly closed. The patrolling soldiers in the city began to be on high alert. Every household closed their doors and windows. After sunset, no one was allowed to walk on the street. The prosperous trading scene of the border counties of the past could no longer be seen. The county governor's mansion had now become the marshal's mansion. In the backyard, Adeline stood there quietly. Her eyes were fixed on the southern sky. The cold wind blew against her tender face and seeped through the gaps in her collar. It was bone-chilling. Adeline waited until the last rays of the sun had disappeared before sighing softly. A trace of disappointment flashed across her pair of bright and beautiful eyes. Behind her, at the door to her room, was Daphne, the current empress of the Byzantine Empire. She stood by the door and quietly looked at Adeline. She had a shawl wrapped around her head, covering her head of brilliant golden hair. Her originally gorgeous face, which was capable of causing the downfall of nations, had become somewhat haggard after being tormented by her illness for so long. Her chin had become sharper and her eye sockets had become deeper. Her face had also lost some of its color. However, it gave her a sense of delicate beauty. Seeing Adeline standing in the courtyard in a daze, the Empress did not say anything to dissuade her. She was already used to it. Since Shea went to war, Adeline would stand in the courtyard and stare blankly at the south almost every night. She would not return to her room until sunset. In the first 2 days, Daphne would try to dissuade her. She was worried that her good friend, whom she had known since childhood, would really fall ill from the cold. However, every time she tried to dissuade her, it was useless. Standing in the cold wind and staring at the south every day until sunset had become a strange psychological comfort for Adeline. After 2 days, Daphne saw that her good sister was so worried and concerned. The original worry in her heart gradually changed. She did not know when it started, but a trace of envy emerged in her heart and could no longer be hidden. Yes, it was envy. She was really envious. Even Daphne herself could not understand such emotions. Perhaps it was pure envy. Whether it was concern or worry, it was fine. At the very least, his younger sister still had someone she cared about in her heart. She looked to the south every day. At least there was a man she cared about in the south. In comparison, she seemed to be muddle-headed. Was it concern? Was there anyone or anything in her heart that she cared about? Father? Family? There was a thought hidden in Daphne's heart. For many years, she might not even be willing to admit it in her heart. Since that year, her father married her into the royal family for political purposes and became the honorable crown princess. It seemed to be glorious and honorable, but in fact, he had pushed his woman into this cold whirlpool. Probably, from that moment on, hatred for her father had grown in her heart. Yes, it was hatred. So what if he was a veteran in the army? So what if he was a famous general? So what if he was all-powerful? In the end, he couldn't even protect his own daughter. His own woman was pushed out like a commodity. She was used as a bargaining chip. She was used as an exchange capital. She was given to the royal family in exchange for the safety of his family. What about her husband? Thinking of her husband in name, Daphne did not even have the strength to smile bitterly in her heart. It seemed that in the entire empire, in the circle of the nobles, she was simply a big joke. So what if she was stunning? So what if she was the most beautiful woman? That husband, when did he even look her in the eye? Every woman, every girl, from the age of a flower, who had not dreamed of love, who had not fantasized about the future, who had not fantasized that in the future there would be such a person who would treat her like a treasure and love her dearly. However, his dream had probably been cut off from the very beginning. What about the rest? Forget it, forget it. Sometimes, Daphne couldn't help but think, so what if I really die? It seems that's it. In this world, I have nothing to worry about. Whether I'm alive or dead, my heart is a blank. For a person who has nothing to worry about, no matter how honorable and beautiful she is, what's the difference between being alive and being dead? With her hand on the door, Daphne sighed faintly. Adeline finally turned around and smiled at her. The wind is very cold, let's go in. Poor thing seemed to be not satisfied with her worries. She was also worried for her sister. Your body has not recovered yet. Every day you accompany me to stand in the wind. What if your illness relapses? As she spoke, she came forward and gently hugged Daphne. Her soft body leaned against her good friend whom she regarded as her own sister. Her face hung on Daphne's shoulder and pressed against her neck. Suddenly, she said in a low voice, I was so worried. Daphne sighed and gently hugged her little sister. After thinking about it, she did not say any words of comfort. She simply said, let's go in. Naturally, the room was warm. The fireplace was burning and the warmth of the flames spread throughout the room. After entering the room, Adeline stamped her feet. Next, she brought over a cup of hot water and handed it to Daphne. She looked at Daphne and whispered, after he left for war, "You moved here to accompany me. These past few days, you have been exposed to the wind and your face is not looking too good. It's all my fault. From tomorrow onwards, I will not let you be exposed to the wind anymore." Accepting the cup of hot water, Daphne felt a sense of loss. She looked at Adeline who was standing before her. A strange feeling suddenly welled up within her. For many years, she had been the elder sister while this good friend of hers was the younger sister. She had always been the one taking care of her. However, now that the two of them were together, it seemed as though this little sister of hers, who had not grown up in the past, had gradually matured. Not only did she have concerns, she also seemed to know how to take care of others. "That fellow is truly ruthless. When he said he would leave for war, he did not think that you would be so concerned about him. If something were to happen to him—" Daphne shook her head and whispered, "Most men think about their ambitions. It seems this fellow is no exception." Suddenly, her heart skipped a beat and she said, "He had disappeared for many days before hurriedly returning and leaving for war. Did he say anything about his marriage with you? You have come all this way to follow him. After so many days, even if it is just a title, he should have given you one, right? Just hold a wedding here in this city. Even if it is a little simple, it is not impossible to keep delaying it like this." Adeline shook her head. Her face was calm as she said softly, "He naturally has things to do. There are so many burdens on his shoulders. The lives of tens of thousands of soldiers and hundreds of thousands of citizens are all on his shoulders. His heart is full. How can I use this matter to trouble him?" Daphne lowered her head and thought for a moment. Then, her face suddenly changed. "He has been delaying the wedding with you. Could it be that he is not confident? In this world of war, he is afraid that something will happen to him. He does not dare to drag you down. If that is the case, it can be considered that he is thinking about you." Sigh. "That is not the case." Adeline smiled softly and said softly, "If he really thinks that way, although I will be touched, I will also be angry. Since I have already abandoned everything to follow him here, I naturally have no other thoughts in my heart. Whether he is a marshal or a coachman, I will always follow him. Who cares if he is a burden or not? Shea is not an indecisive person. If he does not understand something, he will naturally hesitate. But once he does, he will be more decisive than anyone else. He has already told me clearly," said. At this point, the poor thing's face turned red and her voice became softer. "He said, in this life, I am destined to be his woman. This is something that not even the gods can change. It would never change again, it would never change again. In the chaos of war, there is life and death. He has thought about these things, and I have also thought about it. Even if something happens, even if I die, I will still be his woman and he will still be my man. It will never change. In fact, before he went to war, I told him that if anything happens to him, I will not live alone in this world. Even if I go to another world, I will always be with him. Follow him." Daphne's face changed and she exclaimed, "How can you have such thoughts? The chaos of war has no eyes. What if? Even if he is a great general or marshal in the midst of war, who can guarantee that nothing will happen? You must not have such absurd thoughts in your heart." The poor thing's face did not change. Instead, her eyes softened and she said softly, You are scolding me back then. When I told him about these thoughts, I was also worried that he would scold me. But you know what? Sister Daphne, he did not scold me." "What?" Daphne's heart sank. He did not scold you? What did he say?" The poor thing smiled and said softly, "He listened to me and was silent for a moment. Then, he said to me, 'Good. This is my, Shea's, woman. Even if I die, you will still be mine. No one can take you away. For the sake of your words, I will come back alive. Don't worry, in this world, the one who can kill your man has yet to be born. Even if the heavens want to kill me, Lao Tzu will go all out and crawl back to your side alive. After saying that, the smile on the poor thing's face deepened. The happiness in her eyes was not concealed at all. Looking at Daphne, she said softly, "Sister, listen. This fellow has always spoken and acted in such a messy and absurd manner. However, I like him, I love him." Hearing that, Daphne's heart was at a loss. Faintly, she felt a sense of loss. Those words were absurd to the extreme. She wanted to reprimand them, but she was unable to say a single word. These two fellows, one is a bastard and the other is absurd. However, the happiness and sweetness in their words. She was the one who was envious. One said, "I am willing to die for you." The other said, "All right, then let's die together." Absurd to the extreme. However, if they did not love each other to the extreme, how could they say such words? If there was concern and love in the heart, would there really be such absurd happiness? The poor thing looked at Daphne's dazed expression and walked up to her. Gently holding her hand, he said softly, "Good sister, you must not say this to anyone else. Especially Shea's adoptive mother, Lady Merlin. To be honest, I am still very afraid of her." Daphne was absent-minded and smiled bitterly. "That Lady Merlin, I don't even dare to see her. If not for the fact that she is not in the city now, how would I dare to move here to accompany you? Don't worry, I will never have the chance to say this to her." The poor thing smiled. The two girls held each other's hands and looked at each other. Daphne looked into the poor thing's eyes and did not know what to feel. Was it worry or envy? For a moment she was speechless. After a moment of silence, they suddenly heard a voice coming from above their heads. It immediately broke the silence in the room and startled the two girls. "Well said. Although your words are crazy, they are in line with that crazy woman Merlin's temperament. You don't have to be afraid of letting her know. If she knows, she will like you even more. That crazy woman's temperament has always been like this. Others may not know, but I know it all too well. Ha! You are an interesting girl. You and that little bastard are indeed a pair." Following this voice, the figure of a man appeared in the room with a whoosh. This figure appeared in front of the two girls as if out of thin air. He had a head of hair that was neither silver nor gray. His clothes were neat and tidy, and his beard was very clean and neat. He did not look young, but his eyes were astonishingly sharp and bright. They did not look like the eyes that an old man should have. The sudden appearance of this old fellow stunned the two girls. Daphne was about to open her mouth to cry out in surprise when she saw this person gently raise his hand. Daphne felt her breathing stagnate, and her cry of surprise was forcibly stifled in her mouth, unable to come out no matter what. "Don't cry out. I'm not a bad person. I'm not a good person either." The old man scratched the back of his head and smiled bitterly. "I'm an old friend of Merlin. I'm just here to visit. Speaking of which, I have some friendship with that little bastard Shea." "Merlin's old friend?" These words calmed the two girls. At this moment, the poor thing seemed to be calmer than Daphne. She stared at the old man in front of her and suddenly said, "You're a good friend of Sir Merlin. Since you're here to visit, why don't you enter from the door but from the sky?" The old man's expression was strange, but he said, "There are those elves in the city. I don't get along with those elves. I'm afraid we'll fight as soon as we meet. Since I'm here as a guest, it's not good to make things difficult for the host. I'll come in quietly and avoid those guys." The poor thing nodded. To be honest, she knew Shea better than Daphne after all. Naturally, she also knew the temper and personality of Shea's foster mother, Merlin. Merlin's behavior was strange. Thinking about it, her friends must be strange as well, right? Although this old man looked strange, he had a kind face and did not seem to have any malicious intent. Still, Daphne was not at ease. Out of habit, she pulled the poor thing to her side and took half a step forward to protect her little sister. Daphne was a weak woman herself. If the old man really had any malicious intent, she would not be able to withstand it. It was just that many years of habit had made her subconsciously take care of her little sister. Seeing this, the old man smiled and took 2 steps back. He casually found a seat in the room and sat down. He raised his hand. "All right, sit down. I said that I have no malicious intent. Naturally, I don't have any malicious intent. If I am here to harm someone, not even the combined might of your city's soldiers and guards would be able to stop this old man." His words were filled with arrogance. However, Daphne and the poor thing dared not think that he was bragging. Since he was Merlin's old friend, to be able to call someone like Merlin an old friend, it was only natural that he was extraordinary. On the other hand, the poor thing's eyes suddenly lit up. Looking at the old man, he probed, "May I ask, is your name Aslan?" Below were some words, not counting the number of words. "A few days ago, I stopped updating. Truth be told, there is nothing much to say. As mentioned in the previous chapter, something happened to my family. My father had a heart problem and had to be hospitalized. Truth be told, humans are truly despicable things. On the eve of New Year's Eve, when I was in the hospital looking at my father, who was sleeping soundly on the hospital bed, I suddenly realized that I had been too little concerned about my father. Writing a book, earning money, publishing, creating a game, one thing after another, they took up almost all of my time. Truth be told, my father's heart had been abnormal for a month. However, he did not say anything about it. As for me, I had been too careless and neglected it. Until that night, his heart suddenly flared up and I sent him to the hospital. The regret in my heart is indescribable with words. Yes, I've made some money in the past 2 years. I've given my family enough money so that we can live comfortably. My father has always been proud of his son when he talks about his son. However, I was busy and was often unable to eat with him, chat with him, or take walks with him. Living together with him caused his heart to feel uncomfortable. It had been a month and I did not know about it. I felt that I deserved to die. Thankfully, the examination and treatment in the hospital was about to end. My father's heart was fine. It was not the kind of illness that I was worried about. In short, he had recovered. I remembered that night in the hospital. In the middle of the night, only the 2 of us were in the ward. My father was lying on the bed and suddenly said to me, "Son, it's been hard on you." "I'm fine. It's just that you are too tired to accompany me at night. You usually stay up late to work." When my father said that, I did not know what to say. After he fell asleep, I went to the bathroom alone and cried. That night in the hospital, I heard the sound of firecrackers in the distance. To be honest, I did not know how to feel. It was very cold. Tomorrow afternoon, my father will have his last examination. If there are no accidents, he will probably be discharged and go home to rest. Fortunately, his condition is well controlled and there are no major problems that I was worried about. After worrying for so many days, my heart finally relaxed a little. I want to tell you that I am very sorry that I have not updated for the past few days. It's not that I do not have time to write. If I really want to write, I can write while sitting in the ward with my notebook. However, at this time, I really can't work. I have things on my mind. I can't do or write. Tonight, I will resume updating. Today, I did not rest. Tomorrow, I will pick my father up and leave the hospital. I will continue to write. Therefore, there will definitely be another chapter during the day. In the following days, I will reject all social engagements and stay at home. Because of my father's health, I am not at ease to let him and my mother stay at home alone. Therefore, I will stay at home. I believe that I will have more time to write. I can't guarantee that I will be able to update, but I will try my best. That's it. Finally, I wish everyone good health. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Who would have thought that the pitiful creature's bashful appearance would cause the old man in front of him, Aslan, to reveal a bashful and embarrassed expression on his old face. He sat there, seemingly bashful as well. After hemming and hawing for a while, he finally sighed. I've indeed come for something. I originally wanted to wait for that kid to help me, but since he's gone to war, I'm afraid he won't be back for a while. I've been waiting and waiting, and my heart is getting anxious from waiting. I'm getting old, so my patience is naturally not as good as before. This matter is neither too big nor too small, but it is something that you can definitely do. If you're willing to help me, I'll have to repay you properly. In this world, there are only a few things that I can't do. As long as you fulfill my wish, I'll do one thing for you. What do you think? The poor thing and Daphne were both stunned. After all, Daphne was the Empress. Whether it was in terms of knowledge or experience, she was always more experienced than the poor thing. Countless thoughts flashed through her mind. Since this person was Merlin's friend, and from his tone, it seemed that he was on equal footing with a top character like Merlin, he must be a very capable big shot. Think about it, for someone like Merlin who had his eyes on the top of his head, how would an ordinary Tom, Dick, or Harry catch his eye? This kind of old monster of the present age all had extraordinary abilities. If she could get a promise from him, it would definitely be a great help in the future no matter how she looked at it. Without waiting for the poor thing to speak, Daphne said in a serious tone, I don't know what you're asking for. Please tell me first. Aslan narrowed his eyes and glanced at Daphne. It was as if Daphne's beautiful face was nothing special in this old man's eyes. He smiled faintly. Looking at the contours of your face. I've been listening to the conversation between the two of you for half a day. You're the current Empress of Byzantium? I find your appearance somewhat familiar. You're from the Minas family, right? Just by looking at your eyes, you have the contours of that kid. Hee Minas, you've indeed inherited that kid's caution and brains. Don't worry, I've said that I won't harm anyone. Naturally, I'm not here to harm anyone. What I'm asking for, you can definitely do it, and it won't take much effort. It's just that to me, it's a very important matter in my life. Speaking up to this point, Aslan was short of breath and her tone was somewhat guilty. I want to ask you to accompany me to meet someone. Amen, I'll make it clear. I want to meet that person, but I don't want that person to know. I want to find someone who knows that person and lure that person to a place. I'll hide in the dark and watch her. That'll be enough. Since that kid knows her, and you're his wife, you naturally know her as well. Since that kid has gone to war, and I've been waiting anxiously, I can only come and beg you. After finishing his words, this old man actually stood up and bowed to the poor thing. His tone was solemn and sincere. To me, this matter is a long-cherished wish. If you're willing to help me fulfill this wish, as long as you say one thing, even if it's in heaven or on earth, this old man will do it for you. Even if you want the Pope's scepter or the Emperor's crown, I'll get it for you. Looking at this old man's solemn face and bowing to him, the poor thing's heart softened. His face blushed a little as he hurriedly moved aside and said in a low voice, Please tell me, who do you want me to meet? Aslan's old face turned red. That Wildfire Town, Sophia. Her current name should be Sophia, right? Looking at the poor thing and Daphne's strange expressions, Aslan hurriedly coughed. I know that you two don't want to travel far, but although Wildfire Town is quite far from here, this old man can bring you there in the time it takes to stomp my feet. I can make more than 10 round trips in just a moment. We'll go there immediately and send you back after we meet the person. If we're fast, it won't take more than 15 minutes. If we're slow, it won't take more than 1 or 2 hours. Seeing that the two girls didn't say anything, Aslan sighed. I've waited for dozens of years for this day. Shea, that fellow, has set off for battle. I've waited and waited and waited until today. I really can't wait any longer. If I can't meet her immediately, this old man will really go crazy." Daphne didn't say anything, but the poor thing was. After all, she was a person who was passionately in love. Seeing the little bit of infatuation hidden in this old man's eyes, she suddenly understood something. Anyone who was in love would always sympathize with someone who was also in love. The poor thing hesitated for a moment. Without waiting for Daphne to speak, he nodded. "All right, I will accompany you." Aslan was instantly delighted. However, the poor thing immediately thought of something and immediately said, "But I also have something that I need your help with." Aslan laughed and even boldly said, "Say it." "I'll accompany you to meet Aunt Sophia. After we return, I want you to look for Shea. I know that you're a person with great abilities. I don't ask for anything else. I only ask that you can protect his safety." Aslan was stunned. Looking at the poor thing, she hesitated for a moment before saying with a wry smile, "This request isn't difficult. However, this old man doesn't want to lie to a little girl like you. I can do what you want me to do. However, you don't need to beg me and waste this opportunity." After pausing for a moment, Aslan smiled. That fellow Shea had just set off for battle, and Merlin had also left the city. Where do you think that crazy woman went? Don't worry. Although that woman's mouth is firm, she is actually very concerned about that fellow. She has already secretly followed him. With her protecting him in the dark, Shea will definitely return without losing a single hair. Phew! Shea desperately exhaled a mouthful of hot air. Sitting on the back of the horse, he was already sweating profusely. As the cold wind blew, his body shivered once more. Next, he saw a large tree flying past him. He reached out with his hand and grabbed a clump of snow from the tree branch. Then, he used the clump of snow to rub his face. The cold snow rubbed against his face, causing his face to turn red. The accumulated snow also melted into ice water. Shea swung his hand fiercely and immediately felt more spirited. Behind him, a long line of horses was quietly galloping. Within the team, there were still 3 horses per man as they galloped past the sparse forest. The weather was getting colder with each passing day. However, at that moment, Shea's heart was like a burning charcoal. Carefree. This was carefree. In the first battle 2 days ago, the 800 riders that he had personally trained had annihilated 1,000 of Odin's elites in one fell swoop. It was an overwhelming victory that allowed Shaya to see the true strength of the riders. Over the next 2 days, the 800 riders galloped all the way like a sharp dagger plunging into the heart of Ilton County. They covered hundreds of li in a single day, moving as fast as lightning. In the next 2 days, they had destroyed another 3 Odin's strongholds. In 3 battles, big and small, they had defeated 3 of Odin's strongholds. Every time, it was an overwhelming victory without any suspense. Such a display of formidable combat power had caused even Shea, the one who came up with the plan for this expedition, to feel some regret. If he had known that this cavalry was so powerful, he would have made other arrangements early on. Otherwise, the results of this battle would have been even greater. After a few battles, Shea had ordered them not to stop. They only collected the horses and livestock from the defeated Odin's strongholds to replenish the normal horses that they had lost along the way. The entire army did not stop and continued to advance into the heart of Ilton County. However, Shea had already changed his previous plan. He had made a small change. The original plan was for this surprise troop to enter the heart of Ilton County and stir up a huge commotion. Then, they would force Odin's army that was besieging Mad Dog Green and his main army to not press too hard. They could even force Meningo to retreat. Then, as long as they messed up the situation, they could seize the opportunity to destroy 1 or 2 of Meningo's troops and take down a few larger towns. Then, they would have won. But now, since they had such a sharp knife in their hands, if they did not make good use of it, would that still be Shea's character? Shea had already changed the route of their march. At this moment, the cavalry was heading south at full speed. There was only one target: the capital city of Ilton County, the Scarlet Snow Army, Meningo's lair. Faster, faster, a little faster. Shea breathed out the air in his chest and shouted in a low voice. The cavalry beside him immediately galloped forward and passed on the commander's order. Shea sat on the horse's back. His body was almost falling apart. However, the fire in his heart was burning fiercely. He gritted his teeth and endured it. He had clearly reached his limit a few times. He was afraid that he would faint. He would bite his tongue hard and let the pain wake him up. If it did not work, he would grab a handful of snow and stuff it into his collar. This action was seen by the personal guards beside him. The entire army of 800 cavalry also saw it. Shea's body had not fully recovered. For this expedition, he appeared to be a little weak. He was no longer as valiant as he was when he was serving in the Roadrear Cavalry Corps. However, the vigor he displayed at this moment was ruthless enough. He could endure and endure. Since the commander was like this, the people under him would naturally follow suit. The army had always respected brave heroes. Shea had originally made a name for himself through his bravery. He was famous for his battle record against Hastings on the battlefield. For this expedition, his body was different. When it came to the real battle, the charge at the front line, the matter of leading the troops to charge into the enemy's formation and kill the enemy was all borne by this female hero. Shea had instead become the commander, who really held the fort at the back. If this continued for a long time, the prestige he had accumulated in the army in the early days would inevitably decline. But along the way, he had been so ruthless to himself that it had a better effect. Shea's current ability in terms of martial strength was perhaps not very good. However, he was worthy of the word brave. People who were ruthless to themselves could often be even more ruthless to their enemies. Such a person was even more worthy of respect. Originally, although it was awe-inspiring for him to torture himself like this, the personal guards beside him were really worried that this commander would not be able to hold on. If this commander fell halfway, it would be terrible. However, a miracle happened. Shea was obviously very weak 2 days ago. He even used a rope to tie himself to the horse's back in order to move forward with the troops. However, he gritted his teeth and persevered day and night. He used pain and cold to stimulate his body and spirit. However, his originally weak body had clearly reached its limit several times in the past few days. However, he had miraculously pulled through. Moreover, it seems that in the last 2 days, Shea didn't even use a rope to tie himself up and was able to gallop on his horse. Although he was still somewhat clumsy and slow, he was already a lot better than before. Even Shea himself felt that he could not understand. The pain had reached the extreme. The exhaustion had also reached the extreme. The mental exhaustion had also reached the extreme. However, every time he thought that he was going to collapse, he would not be able to hold on any longer. However, when he finally pulled through, his body would suddenly feel lighter. His originally heavy body seemed to have gradually regained its former sensitivity and sharpness bit by bit. That clumsy feeling made him feel as if his bones were rusty iron. However, after enduring the bumpy ride day and night on the horse's back, the rusty things in his body seemed to be shaken off bit by bit as the horse moved forward. It was as if the rust on a rusty gear had been removed and it gradually began to operate again. In the beginning, it was somewhat sluggish. However, it gradually became smoother. It seemed as if there was something superfluous and useless in his body. Something that had previously restricted the normal operation of his body was dissipating, melting, and fading away bit by bit. The sweat on his body flowed away and disappeared. This feeling was extremely painful and exhausting, but it was also extremely pleasurable. Run. Run non-stop. Run with all your might. This seemed to be the only thought left in Shea's mind. Perhaps, by the time he reached this part of the road, the him who was brimming with strength should have returned. While lying on the horse's back, Shea suddenly extended his hand into a long leather pouch that was hanging on the horse's saddle. It felt cold, hard, and sharp. This was his flaming fork. The flaming fork that had never left his side in the past. Since the last time he was seriously injured, his body had been weakened to the extreme. He was no longer able to wield this flaming fork. With such a heavy weapon hanging on his body, it would be a huge burden to his weak body. In the past, even if he were to wield a wooden stick that was as light as a feather, he would still be gasping for breath. For someone who was once majestic and brave, Shea, who once dared to lead 100 riders to charge into Odin's Black Flag army, this feeling was already extremely sullen. Stroking the flaming fork within the leather pouch, the fire in Shea's heart increased by several degrees. Run. Continue to run. Run with all your might. Once I reach the end of this road, I will personally use this flaming fork to cleave apart all the thorns blocking my path. The horse's hooves were hurried. The knight in front and behind him was anxiously leaning on the horse's back as he sped forward. No one noticed that the place where Shea's hand had reached into the leather pouch had a faint flame flickering in and out. Break! Break! In the end, he will have to break through this shackle. A voice roared within Shea's heart. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 463. GOR Chapter 433 Breaking Out of the Cage. 3. The capital of Ilton County, the new city. In the northern part of the Byzantine Empire, this new city lived up to its name. Compared to the capitals of the other prefectures, the history of this new city was less than 50 years old. The northern prefectures of the Byzantine Empire were more important to the Byzantine Empire than the other prefectures in the north. In order to defend against the invaders and to deter the nearby Tema military region, Ilton Prefecture had always been more important to the Byzantine Empire than the other prefectures. The geographical location of Ilton County was close to the former Corsica military district. To the south was Moore County. Although it was a large production area, it did not have to worry about being directly threatened by foreign enemies like Moore County. The only thing that needed to be guarded was the surrounding Tema military district. Therefore, the Central Army of the Northern Empire, such as the former 7th Division, had always been stationed in Ilton County and not in border counties like Moore County. It was all for the sake of deterring internal strife. This new city was the capital city that the Empire had invested considerable financial resources into. After 50 years of operation and construction, it had become the most majestic city in the Northern Empire. Previously, the 7th Division was stationed here. It could be said that in the imperial family's vision, Ilton County and the 7th Division stationed here would always be a nail nailed into the ground, regardless of whether it was an invasion from foreign enemies or internal strife. Unfortunately, in this war, Odin's Scarlet Snow Army marched straight in. The Scarlet Snow Army's leader, Manninger, was a man of great talent. In addition, the Byzantium's internal strife never stopped. The destruction of the 7th Division directly led to the fall of Ilton County. And this new city fell into Manninger's hands. After obtaining this majestic city that the Empire had spent 50 years to build, Manninger's ambition was immediately ignited. This majestic city's defenses were high and could accommodate a population of 200,000 with tens of thousands of troops stationed in the city. Due to the geographical environment of Ilton County being flat plains, it lacked mountains and natural barriers. As an important stronghold in the planning, this city was built to be exceptionally strong. The city's defenses were built with huge stones. Almost half of the revenue of the northern counties of the empire for decades was spent on this city. After obtaining this majestic city, Manninger immediately made it his base. Even after annexing the Corsica military district, he did not move his base elsewhere. Instead, he firmly rooted himself in this city. Even the most elite troops of the Scarlet Snow Army were personally stationed here by Manninger. In Manninger's heart, this was the foundation of the Scarlet Snow Army when they annexed this land in the future. With this majestic city as their base, they would be able to survey hundreds of miles of land around them, radiating out to the entire county of Ilton. The surrounding towns and villages were all within the radius of this new city. The roads were flat, and the cavalry could travel hundreds of miles without any obstacles. This was exactly in line with Manninger's strategy of having a strong foundation and strong branches. Originally, there were more than 100,000 Byzantium residents in the new city. After the city fell, they were all forcibly expelled by Manninger to other places. The young and strong were filled with slaves to build the settlement areas where the future Odin's people would migrate. They built new houses and built new villages. As for the old and the weak, they were all slaughtered by the merciless Odin's people when winter came. It was not that Manninger was cruel, but he was really short on food. In order to feed his Odin's Scarlet Snow Army, how could he have extra food to feed the people? Those who were crueler were directly slaughtered. Even those who were slightly gentler were banished to the wilderness and left to fend for themselves. In this harsh winter, which was rarely seen in decades, many of the old and weak in Ilton County were banished to the wilderness to eat and sleep in the open. In this snow and ice, they had no food, no clothes, and no shelter. Countless of them froze to death. More of them turned into starving corpses in the wilderness. In the new city, there were only a few thousand women left. These women were purposely left behind by Manninger's order to be used as military prostitute. The Odins were barbaric and cruel. Manninger understood that the army had been out on expeditions for a long time and had tens of thousands of valiant warriors. If they didn't have a woman for a long time and their energy wasn't discovered, it would inevitably lead to chaos. Therefore, when the Odin's people went to war, in order to stimulate their morale, the leader would often promise that every time they conquered a place, they would be allowed to massacre the city, burn and loot to their heart's content, and command the troops at will. However, at this moment, in this winter war, in order to take down the army led by the Mad Dog Grim, who was heading south, Manninger had already mobilized most of his forces. Most of the garrisons in various places were also transferred. He concentrated almost all of his mobile forces, hoping to eliminate this little hidden danger in the north in one battle. Once the retreat route was cleared, his Scarlet Snow Army would no longer be a threat in the north of the Byzantium Empire. He could then move his tribe here without any worries. For this goal, Manninger even went all out. The tens of thousands of Scarlet Snow Army's most elite warriors, who were originally stationed in the new city, were all brought out for battle. The troops of the Odin's people had always been mixed up. However, in every army there were naturally true elite. For example, in the Scarlet Snow Army, as one of the 5 major tribes of the Odin, Manninger's tribe's path to greatness was also through countless internal annexation wars, large and small. The larger tribes would eat up the smaller tribes and gradually become stronger. Once war broke out, the entire tribe would naturally be mobilized. Among the tens of thousands of warriors in the Scarlet Snow Army, more than half of them were from other small tribes that had been annexed by the tribes. However, Manninger always had 10,000 elites by his side. These were the true pure-blooded young elites of his own tribe. Whether it was equipment or supplies, they were the priority to attack. In terms of loyalty, the people of his own tribe were also more loyal than the warriors of other tribes. In times of crisis, these elite warriors of his own tribe were willing to fight to the death for the tribe's benefit. These elites were the foundation of the Scarlet Snow Army. This time, in order to wipe out the hidden dangers in the north in one fell swoop, Manninger mobilized the army and even personally led these elites by his side to leave the new city. They went all the way north to encircle Mad Dog Green's tribe. At this moment it was sunrise. Outside the new city there was a flat wilderness. There were no hillsides or similar terrain. Even the few forests that were originally very close to the city defense were cut down by Manninger during the winter and turned into firewood for warmth during the winter. At this moment, after the heavy snow, the wilderness was white. Those forests that were cut down were only left with bare and low tree stumps standing there. Manninger personally went to battle. At this moment, the one who stayed behind to guard the new city was Manninger's eldest son, Morka. Speaking of which, this son of the chief deserved to be unlucky. In the tribe, as the eldest son of the chief, he was originally the target of great efforts to cultivate. This time, Manninger only brought his eldest son with him when he went all out to invade the south. In his heart, he hoped that this son would make meritorious contributions in the war and accumulate prestige, so that he could be prepared to take over in the future. Morka himself was actually quite capable. As the son of the chief, he naturally went through strict training since he was young. Needless to say, he was naturally brave. With the Odin's blood, coupled with the family inheritance and Manninger's training, his bravery in martial arts had always been outstanding in the tribe. Intelligence and wisdom had always been the shortcomings of the Odin, but his father, Manninger, happened to be an anomaly among the Odin. As the chief of the Odin, he was quite resourceful and scheming. He had been trained since he was young. Although Morka could not match up to his father in terms of intelligence and wisdom, he was considered to have some brains compared to the rash and fierce temperament of the average Odin. Manninger was also very satisfied with his cautiousness in doing things. It was just that this guy's life was not very good. Since the expedition to the south, every time he stood out, he would encounter something unlucky. At the beginning of the expedition to the south, Manninger ordered him to occupy Wildfire Town. As a result, he provoked the hidden dragons and crouching tigers in Wildfire Town. He was even chased out of the town by Aunt Sophia. With this failure, he immediately lost some of his prestige. Before winter, Manninger sent him to lead troops to the north in order to wipe out the resistance forces of the Shea in the north in one fell swoop. Morka brought thousands of Odin warriors to the north. He thought that with these people, even if they encountered a Byzantium army, they would not be afraid. As long as he killed those mobs in the north, it would naturally be like pouring boiling water on snow. Shea created a white wizard Todoro on the left and a war tree fortress on the right. As a result, Morka's face was covered in dirt and he suffered heavy losses. He retreated in a panic. The Odin people valued military achievements the most. As the son of the patriarch, he was the focus of attention. Lao Tzu also gave him a chance, but every time he kicked an iron plate. Since the expedition to the south, whenever he led troops alone, he had not been able to do anything impressive. Not only did many of the leaders and generals in the tribe disapprove of him, even Manninger himself could not help but be a little disappointed in his son. Therefore, in this winter war, Manninger simply left Morka at the rear to guard his nest. With Morka's ability, plus his own instructions, as long as he was careful, there would not be any major trouble in the rear. In the new city, Manninger left behind more than 2,000 Odin elite warriors of his own bloodline and 5,000 surrendered troops of the Corsica military region for Morka. With so many troops in the rear, if anything happened to Morka, even Manninger himself wouldn't believe it. In the early morning, it was late in the winter, but there was ice and snow between heaven and earth. Even though the sun had not risen, the light was still silvery white and was not dim. In the wilderness north of the new city, a commotion in the distance alarmed the Odin warriors guarding the city. Morka was indeed cautious in his actions. He did not carelessly hand over the city defense to the surrendered Corsica troops and indulged his Odin warriors to slack off and rest. Instead, he ordered that half of the Odin warriors and half of the surrendered troops be on duty every night. This order was cautious enough. He was the eldest son of the patriarch. Although the Odin warriors below him were dissatisfied, they did not dare to disobey. At this moment, there was a sudden rush of movement in the distance. Some Odin warriors turned over and lifted the blankets on their bodies, leaning out of the wall to look into the distance. In the direction of the north, in the snow, a cloud of snow and dust could be seen flying and filling the sky. A group of cavalry came from the north far away, but they were as fast as lightning. In this wilderness, they splashed and galloped as if they were flying. They were heading straight for the new city. They were all war horses galloping, and there were no reindeer. Obviously, they were not their own army. These Odin warriors were all elite. They quickly identified the incoming cavalry team. There were probably 2,000 to 3,000 riders. However, from a distance, although there were many horses, there were fewer cavalrymen on the backs of the horses. It was obvious that they were elite cavalrymen who had come from a long distance with horses. Soon, the call of the horn alarmed the entire city defense. The Odin warriors shouted, urged, and scolded. There were also the roars of the officers. They ran back and forth, kicking up the subordinates who were wrapped in blankets and sheltering in the corners. The urgent horn soon came from the top of the city. Ha, the Odin people are not slow. When the cavalry team galloped to a place a stone's throw away from the city defense, the cavalry team suddenly came to a halt. 800 cavalrymen with over 2,000 horses lined up in the snow. Naturally, some of the cavalrymen took out their flag from the backs of their horses and raised it with their spears. In the snow, the soldiers shouted and the horses neighed. A Byzantine Empire's eagle-head military flag fluttered in the wind. Shea sat on the back of his horse. Although he had been galloping for the entire night, his face was flushed red. Although he had perspired a lot, the sweat on his forehead and face had turned into ice beads. Even his eyebrows had turned white. However, his face was faintly glowing with a red glow. Even his eyes had a sharpness that had not been there for the past few days. He raised his hand fiercely and the cavalrymen behind him immediately began to move. They split into 2 groups. The cavalrymen dismounted and changed into the specially bred giant war horses. The rear group changed their equipment while the front group was on guard. Then they rotated. In less than an hour, when the sun rose, the 800 cavalrymen had changed into the most elite armors and horses. Quietly, the cavalrymen got into position and spread out in the snow. There was not a trace of movement. Shea. Nene rode his horse to Shea's side. He first looked at him with concern. Seeing that Shea was in high spirits, he felt relieved and whispered, "Why don't we think of a sneak attack? Attacking the city with cavalrymen is not a good idea." Shea pondered for a moment and looked at Nene. Then, he turned his gaze to the city defense and said indifferently, "A sneak attack will not work. On our way here, we have defeated 3 to 4 groups of Odin's men. Even if we continue to move forward day and night, the news would have reached here long ago. The other party is prepared. If we suddenly attack the city, our chances are not high. Why don't we prepare carefully here, get into position and wait for Odin's men to come out? Then, we will fight them head-on." Nene glanced at the city wall and listened to the movements in the distance. He frowned and said, "Will they come out?" Shea smiled. "We only have so few men and horses. The surrounding is also a flat wilderness. There is no way to hide any ambushes. The Odin's men have always been very proud. They think of themselves as brave and valiant. With so few men and horses, we have come here to provoke them. The military strength in the city is also higher than ours. If they still don't come out to fight, then they are not the Odin's men." After a pause, he said slowly, The Odin's men have always looked down on the Byzantine army. Even a few hundred Odin's cavalrymen dared to charge at an emblem group of Byzantine army. We only have a few hundred cavalrymen here. If the leaders of the city's guards don't come out to fight, they will not be able to lift their heads up in the tribe in the future. Don't worry, they will definitely come out. After another glance at Nene, Shea said in a low voice, "According to the information obtained from the captives, the leader of this new city is Manninger's son, Morka. That guy and I have crossed paths before. Every time we met, his face was covered in dirt. I'm afraid he is more eager than anyone else to win a few battles to regain his reputation. Since he has such thoughts, I'm not afraid of him cowering in the city." After that, he remained calm and collected, quietly looking in the direction of the city's defenses as he waited. Sure enough, Shea's analysis was right. Although the city wall was a little confused by the sudden attack of the enemy, when they saw that the enemy was only a few hundred cavalrymen, the arrogance in the Odin's bones quickly emerged. Morka, who was in the city, naturally received the report and immediately rushed to the city. After looking into the distance for a while, Morka was puzzled. However, he was certain of one thing: the number of cavalrymen outside the city was indeed not bad. They were surrounded by wilderness. Even if they wanted to hide an ambush, it was impossible. 2 days ago, he also received news that a small group of Byzantium cavalrymen had killed their way into Ilton County. They wreaked havoc everywhere and also defeated a few local defenders. Although the news was a little surprising, it was only a small group of enemies that came in to harass the city wall. It was not a big deal. Thinking about it, it was only the commander of the Byzantium army who sent out a small group of cavalrymen to harass the city wall. It was nothing more than a tactic to attract the attention of Morka's army and reduce the pressure on the main army. Previously, he heard that a few groups of defenders were defeated. Although the news was a little shocking, Morka thought that it was most likely because they were caught off guard by the ambush. If it was an open field battle, a single Odin warrior could defeat 3 times the number of Byzantium soldiers. After thinking about it several times, Morka felt that he had no more doubts. He immediately made up his mind. Open field battle outside the city. There were 2,000 of Morka's elites in the city and thousands of surrendered soldiers. The other party only had a few hundred cavalrymen. Since they were so crazy as to send themselves to him, he had to swallow the other party to show his strength. The heroes of the Odin did not have the tradition of cowering. However, Morka was still cautious. He weighed the pros and cons and ordered that 500 of the 2,000 Odin elite warriors in the city would be left behind to defend the city. He would only take 1,500 men out of the city for the open field battle. After all, according to the news he received, the enemy cavalrymen were still quite powerful. With 1,500 men out in the open field, they would have twice the number of enemies. In addition to the bravery of the elite warriors, defeating the enemy was not a problem. However, he had to ensure that the enemy was completely annihilated in order to show his strength. Leaving 500 Odin warriors to defend the city was also the reason why his father told him to be cautious before he left. Manninger was really good to his son. The 2,000 elites left in the city were all Odin's elite cavalrymen. They were all equipped with reindeer mounts. These pure-blooded elites of the clan were the essence of the Scarlet Snow Army. In the previous war to annex the Corsica military region, 10,000 of the clan's elites had defeated the Corsicans' main army on the battlefield and killed the Corsicans until they were defeated thousands of miles away. With these assets in his hands, Morka could not be blamed for being careless. Outside the city, Shea had been waiting for a long time. He was not in a hurry at all. He had continuously galloped here. The longer he waited, the more the cavalrymen under him could recover their strength and horsepower. Seeing that the sound of war drums had finally sounded in the city, the heavy city gate slowly opened. Shea was finally energized. Nene! he shouted, and Nene immediately rode her horse to his side. Shea took a deep breath, looked inside, and said slowly, "You and I both know about the news of the interrogation of the captives. In this new city, there are no Byzantium residents now. The old and weak have been cleaned up by Manninger, and the young and strong have been driven to the south to build the new city. There were originally a few thousand female slaves in the city, but I'm afraid that they have all become corpses now." Nene's eyes flashed, and a trace of murderous intent faintly flowed through. Previously, she had defeated a few troops of Odin's army and obtained the news of the new city from the captives. Although there were originally a few thousand female slaves in the new city, Manninger had already ordered that all the female slaves in the city were to be slaughtered before the expedition this time. This was a method that Manninger had always used to lead his troops. He was very clear that these elite warriors under his command needed to vent their energy. When he had occupied this place previously, he had left a few thousand female slaves and allowed the soldiers to abuse them. But once the war came, he would kill all these female slaves. Firstly, it would eliminate the thoughts in the hearts of the soldiers, and secondly, it would conserve the energy of the soldiers under him before the war. Thirdly, it would stimulate the morale and fighting spirit of the soldiers. The women had been killed. If they wanted more women in the future, they would have to defeat the enemy in front of them again and then snatch new women. This method could be said to be cruel, but in Manninger's hands it worked every time. It became an important method for him to lead his troop. Just before he went north this time, he had already slaughtered all the female slaves in the city. As a woman, Nene naturally hated this kind of evil. At this moment, when Shea suddenly mentioned it, she immediately felt the murderous intent of Nene's young miss surging to the sky. "Very well, since you know it in your heart, I won't say anything more." Shea pointed to the front. "Break this city. There are only Odin's people and the surrendered troops in the city. Attack and kill. I want Morka's head, and I want the heads of all the Odin's people in this city. The debt of blood will be repaid with blood." Nene snorted and was already holding a mace. She said in a deep voice, "Shea, Morka's head, I will definitely take it for you." Shea shook his head. "Morka must have brought out a large group, but I can only give you 500 cavalrymen. I will leave 300 cavalrymen behind to hold the line. You will defeat Morka's large group in the front, and I will bring 300 cavalrymen to sweep down and take advantage of the situation to rush into the city gate." After a pause, he took a deep breath and his eyes flashed. "Remember, there is only one chance. If he runs in and closes the city gate, we are cavalrymen after all. No matter how good we are at fighting in the field, we can't use our heads to break open the city wall. You defeat the enemy in front, and I will rush in and take the gate. Success or failure, it will be decided in an instant." The rumbling of war drums came. From the city gate, the Odin's reindeer cavalrymen slowly came out and formed a formation under the city gate. The Odin's people were indeed a barbaric race. These were the elites of the Scarlet Snow Army, and they were the essence of the Scarlet Snow Army. Each of them had a strong body, and were covered in heavy black armor. The reindeer mounts under them were also the most majestic livestock that had been carefully selected. Morka was covered in a pure black heavy armor. He had a strong body and held a giant double-edged battle axe in his hand. He was at the front of the team. With a roar, more than 1,000 Odin's elites behind him raised their swords, axes, and iron hammers. With a roar, the momentum was like thunder. From afar, the Odin's people were ferocious, but Shea suddenly showed a strange smile on his face. He gently wiped away the ice beads on his face, then raised his hand and pointed at the Odin's troops that were leaving the city. At this moment, Shea's tone was cold and indifferent, and it even contained a hint of awe-inspiring power. That tone, however, was a kind of understatement, as if it was a kind of arrogance that was about to be extinguished. At this moment, he only said a sentence softly. Go, destroy them. Like a tide. White was snow. Black was iron. Red was blood. The momentum of the Odin's people was like a mountain, like a torrent. When the 1,500 cavalrymen rushed up fiercely, Morka was in the team. What made Morka furious was that the few hundred Byzantium cavalrymen in front of him actually split up. There were only a few hundred cavalrymen, but only half of them rushed up. The remaining team was still standing quietly in the distance, majestic and unmoving. This was a kind of contempt, blatant disdain. Were these Byzantium people crazy? They were already at a disadvantage in terms of military strength, and they actually dared to leave behind a team of reserves. And the hundreds of Byzantium cavalrymen rushing up in front of him made Morka look down on them even more. Hundreds of cavalrymen charging, but they were quiet, as if those cavalrymen did not even have the strength to shout to boost their morale? Hundreds of cavalrymen charging up so quietly. Nothing more than that. Nothing more than that. The momentum of the Odin's charge was so fierce, like a raging tide. The 1,500 cavalrymen did not leave a single one behind, and all of them pressed forward. In the wilderness, a black wave was seen slapping fiercely. Such a ferocious attack, they were indeed the elites of their own race. If it was on a normal day, these 1,500 soldiers would be able to crush the Byzantine army by several times. In comparison, the hundreds of Byzantium cavalrymen's charge, whether it was momentum or power, seemed to be much, much smaller. One charge would be able to crush them. Then he would personally chop off the head of this enemy general, peel off his skin, and use his skull as a wine vessel. Morka's face was filled with malevolence as he thought of this. But soon, this malevolent expression suddenly stiffened. The two sides of the charge finally collided fiercely in the wilderness outside the city. In an instant, a black mass of figures fell down one after another, like a gale sweeping through a wheat field. Clashing sounds could be heard, figures intersecting, weapons flying back and forth. But what made Morka's heart go crazy was that these Odin's elite cavalrymen charging like a raging tide seemed to have been extinguished in an instant. That black mass of mighty cavalrymen suddenly collapsed in the face of the hundreds of cavalrymen's charge. It collapsed so quickly, so shocking. The Odin's elite cavalrymen charging at the front line fell down almost instantly the moment the two armies clashed. And those cold and silent Byzantium cavalrymen did not even look at the fallen Odin's cavalrymen. They only urged their war horses forward coldly. They did not even want to waste the energy to raise their weapons and reap human lives. In any case, there were still their own troops following behind them. The fallen Odin's cavalrymen were almost trampled into pieces by the charging Byzantium cavalrymen. They were crushed in an instant. The Byzantium cavalrymen were like a heavy hammer, fiercely smashing into the Odin's army. Wherever the cavalrymen passed, a gust of wind would howl. The Odin's cavalrymen were proud of their strength, ferocity, and majesty. But in front of this strange enemy, they were almost completely suppressed. The enemy's strength was greater than yours, their figures were more powerful, and their killing intent was more abundant. Even their charging tactics were far superior to Odin's. The charging formation of the cavalrymen almost instantly broke through the Odin's army. A standard piercing tactic. It directly tore through the charging formation of the Odin's cavalrymen from the thickest part in the middle. Then, the collapse of the Odin's army could no longer be stopped. Morka's surprise, shock, madness, and many other emotions happened in such a short period of time. The Odin's cavalrymen beside him seemed to fall with every breath. Morka waved the battle axe in his hand with all his might, but the enemy's cavalrymen whistled past from all sides. He fiercely smashed away an incoming spear with his axe, but the enemy's strength was so strong that he almost fell off his reindeer. Strong. So strong. How could they be so strong? At this moment, he heard a deep roar in his ear. Like a sudden clap of thunder, Morka was awakened from his daze. Suddenly, an elite guard beside him shouted, "Be careful!" A mace flew over, and the target was obviously Morka's head. The elite guard blocked the attack with his axe in place of Morka, and he immediately spat out blood. His arm made a shocking caw-caw sound. The weapon in his hand, along with his arm, was crushed by the powerful blow. Die! The low roar was in Byzantium that Morka was unfamiliar with. Then, he saw a majestic figure rushing in front of him. The mace swept past, and the guard who risked his life to block the attack for him was swept away like a leaf. The mace was glowing with the light of combat energy, and it smashed down again. After all, Morka was a brave warrior. Almost instinctively, he took a deep breath and blocked the attack with his battle axe. Immediately, he felt his whole body sink. This attack crushed the 4 hooves of the reindeer beneath him. With a roar, the reindeer knelt down on the spot. Morka tasted something sweet in his mouth, and his vision turned black. But this blow immediately woke him up completely. He was really awake. Looking around, the 1,500 elites that he was so proud of had been reduced to less than 30%. The formation that was originally charging forward had been forcefully destroyed by the enemy. The enemy's horses galloped, and who knew how many screams came from the mouths of the Odin warriors. Defeat, a complete defeat without any suspense. Defeated with one blow. Seeing that the enemy cavalry had already charged forward, suppressing his remaining soldiers and heading in the direction of the city defense, Morka finally woke up. City! New city! The new city that his father gave him before he left. The foundation of his entire tribe. Nene had already targeted Morka in the chaos. The first blow was blocked by Morka's elite guard with his life. The second blow made Morka spit out blood, and the reindeer fell to the ground. Nene's arms were also sore, but her mind was strong. She took a deep breath. After the third blow, she had already made up her mind. She must kill this Odin leader on the spot. But when she swung the hammer, Morka suddenly screamed, and his body bounced off the reindeer. Then, he suddenly ran madly towards the city defense behind him. This Odin leader actually ignored the bravery and pride of the Odin people and ran away. When Nene raised her hammer and chased after him, there were already 2 Odin warriors covered in blood beside Morka. They tried their best to block Morka's back. Morka ran back like a madman. After a few steps, he leaped onto an ownerless reindeer. His horsemanship was indeed excellent. He leaped onto the reindeer and leaped into the air. His movements were agile and valiant. But then, he ran madly towards the city gate. He left behind those Odin warriors behind him who were still fighting to the death to protect him. At this moment, Morka was really awake. He could not be proud and brave, even if people would say that he was a coward and was not worthy of being an Odin man for the rest of his life. But he could not lose this city. Close the city gate. Close the city gate. Seeing that they were still far away from the city gate, Morka was already screaming. He spat out blood and roared at the same time. His voice was accompanied by a bloody foam. Nene's eyes were red. She tried her best to move forward, but those Odin people seemed to have finally understood. They blocked in front of her. Even if they were knocked off their reindeer and fell to the ground, they still tried their best to spread their bodies. Even if they were pierced full of holes by the spears of the Byzantium cavalry, they still wanted to fight for a brief moment of survival for Morka, who was running behind them. Nene swung her hammer 3 times and instantly killed 3 Odin elites in front of her. But the anxiety in her eyes was like a fire. Every time she killed a person, Morka would get further away from her. What made Nene even more anxious was that the guards on the city gate seemed to have recovered from their shock. The huge and heavy city gate was slowly closing. If the city gate was closed, no matter how elite her hundreds of cavalrymen were, how could they break through the city wall with their bodies of flesh and blood? Nene roared with all her might. The Byzantium cavalry beside her also charged forward, trampling on the flesh and blood of Odin's remnant soldiers. One step, one kill, one step, one blood. But Morka's figure seemed to have already reached the city gate. The speed at which the city gate was closing was so fast that it made people anxious, but so slow that it made people go crazy. Every time the gate closed, the chances of survival of her army decreased by a little. Not only was Nene anxious, Shea, who was holding the rear, could clearly see Odin escaping from the formation. The remaining Odin soldiers were practically using their flesh and blood to block the charge of his cavalrymen. No matter how much his cavalrymen slaughtered, they still had to buy some time. Seeing the city gate begin to close little by little, Shea's heart was fiercely tangled. Two balls of fire seemed to be bursting out from his eyes. Once the city gate closed, he would lose. No matter how many Odin's people he killed outside the city, this time, he would lose for real. Lost. Completely lost. The traces of his hundreds of cavalrymen had been completely exposed. No matter how strong they were, how big of a wave could a few hundred cavalrymen cause? They had no supplies, no logistics. If Odin's people regained their senses, there would be no chance for them to turn the situation around. The slim chance of survival that he struggled for, the slim hope, would be completely cut off with the closing of the city gate. I can't lose. I can't lose. I can't die. The roar in his heart seemed to have smashed into Shea's soul. The muscles on his face seemed to have contorted into a lump. His majestic body was faintly trembling. His breathing became more and more hurried, more and more frantic. Break. I must break. I must break it. I must break it all. Ah! A mournful roar suddenly reverberated through the wilderness. This roar was filled with struggle, anger, unwillingness, and pain. The voice was hoarse, like that of a wild beast. At this moment, the voice no longer sounded like that of a human, but that of a wolf, a tiger, a lion, a wild beast. This roar, in an instant, seemed to suppress all the war cries on the battlefield. Whether it was the Byzantium cavalrymen or the remnants of Odin's soldiers, they were all shocked by this roar. At this moment, it was as though everyone was suddenly shaken. In an instant, in just an instant, it was as though all the killing, charging, and death had stopped. A red light suddenly came from the north. The sharp red light turned into a line and passed through the entire battlefield. It tore through the air, the wind, and everything. That Morka had already rushed to the city gate. It was only a dozen steps away. He would be able to enter the city gate with just one more step. But at this moment, Morka suddenly flew up from the reindeer's back. A red light pierced into his back, and then he was picked up from the reindeer's back. Behind him, blood spurted out, and on the white snow on the ground, blood splattered everywhere. It was a shocking sight. Morka's body flew straight out and finally slammed into the city gate. Then, his body from his back to his chest was a bloody mess. A long flaming fork pierced through his body, nailing him to the half-closed gate. A figure suddenly flew out from the north of the battlefield. It was as though this figure had just leaped forward, and in the next moment, he was already standing under the city gate of the new city. His majestic body stood upright under the gaze of thousands of pairs of eyes on the city gate and the battlefield. At this moment, his feet were on the ground and his head was in the sky. He stretched out a hand and grabbed the handle of the flaming fork nailed to the city gate. Then, he turned his wrist. With a boom, a red light and a crimson murderous aura destroyed everything in its path. Molka's corpse, along with the huge city gate, was crushed by the red light with a loud bang. Shea stood under the city gate, holding the flaming fork in his hand. Morka's corpse turned into pieces of flesh and blood, and the fragments of the city gate sprayed on his body, but he didn't seem to feel it at all. The huge city gate had no door planks, and Shea stood there alone. It was as if at this moment, regardless of whether it was the enemy or his side, they were all shocked by his heaven-shaking attack. Shea raised the flaming fork and slowly lowered it. He looked at the city gate and then looked up at the sky. Then, he smiled. Since it has been broken, there are no more restrictions. Updated with 10,000 words. I woke up early in the morning and wrote it all morning. In the afternoon, I accompanied the old man to the hospital for a follow-up, so I wrote even more today, to be continued. If you want to know what happened next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 464. Today is Valentine's Day. I wish everyone a happy Valentine's Day, hehe. Reading the comments, some people are speculating whether or not I will take the day off from updating. Some are even betting, with this chapter out, I reckon there will be quite a number of losers. Ha 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 ha. As I said before, I will do my best to update my status. Tonight, I did not go out. I will be writing at home. GOR Chapter 433 Breaking Out of the Cage, 4, Chuck City. This was the first city that Shea's 800-man army had taken down after sneaking into Ilton County. The 1,000-plus Odin soldiers that were originally stationed here had been wiped out in the battle that day. After taking over the small city, Shea's 800-man army did not stay for long. They looted all the horses and livestock within the city to replenish their supplies. Then, they quickly headed south. There were originally 2,000 vassal soldiers within the city. Most of them were the surrendered soldiers of the Corsica military region. There were also a small number of vassal soldiers from Ilton County. After the annexation of Ilton County and the Corsica military region by Meningo, these vassal soldiers either surrendered or were wiped out. In the end, they were all reorganized and put under Meningo's command. At that moment, the 2,000 vassal soldiers within the city had yet to disperse. Shea had only taken a short time to enter and leave the city that day. Back then, Shea's 800-man army was like a hot knife through butter, easily wiping out 1,000 Odin soldiers. After entering the city, the vassal soldiers lost their courage. Forget resisting, they did not even dare think about running away. However, after Shea entered the city, he did not even spare a glance at the vassal soldiers. Some of the officers from the vassal soldiers had wanted to surrender. Unfortunately, Shea showed no interest in them. He simply ignored them. After looting all the supplies he needed, he left the city. Although it had been quite some time since then, the shock that the vassal soldiers received from the battle that day had not dissipated even to this very day. The vassal soldiers within the city did not disperse. After the Odin soldiers within the city were wiped out, the vassal soldiers suddenly realized that they had nowhere else to go. Originally, they were known as the vassal army, but when Uncle Odin was around, who would seriously look at them? These vassal soldiers were all soldiers who had previously surrendered. Most of Odin's people looked down on these fellows. Normally, they would order them around, beat them, and scold them as they pleased. They were like slaves. Now these masters were all killed, and the people who killed Odin's masters also left. This time, the affiliated troops were at a loss. In this cold winter, Odin's people had wreaked havoc across the vast Ilton County. If one were to walk in the wild, they would not see anyone for hundreds of miles. The villages and towns were almost empty. The snow was everywhere. If they really left the city, they would either starve to death or freeze to death in less than 2 days. Originally, in this chaotic world, they would be content if they could struggle and survive. As for who their masters were, in fact, to these vassal soldiers, they did not really care. After all, their homes were gone, and they were rootless people. Whoever is stronger can be the master. Even if Odin's people are defeated and a new group of even more powerful masters comes, we can only obediently listen to them and let them order us around. But the problem was, Shea left without hesitation. He seemed to have no interest in taking in these vassal soldiers. This made people unable to figure out what was going on. All the livestock in the city had been plundered by Shea. There was only a little surplus of food left. Without livestock, if they walked out of the city and took another route, they would naturally die. These 2,000 vassal soldiers had been living in fear for the past few days. They had been used to being servants. Now that they suddenly lost a master who could order them around, they could not bear it anymore. Their biggest worry was that Odin's people would come back. After all, Odin's people were the most powerful in Ilton County. Odin's people were the most ferocious. Once Odin's army came here and found that the Odin's army had been annihilated and their vassal soldiers were unharmed, those ferocious Odin's people would inevitably vent their anger on these surrendered soldiers. At best, they would all be enslaved. At worst, it would be normal for them to be slaughtered. There was no way out and nowhere to go. However, staying in this city and living in fear every day was not a solution. These 2,000 surrendered soldiers had been trapped in Chuck City for the past few days. Day after day, they waited bitterly. Even they did not know what they were waiting for. Naturally, there was no one guarding the city walls for a long time now. This city was ownerless and the surrendered soldiers had no intention of defending the city. Regardless of whether it was Byzantium or Odin's people, when they came, they would just accept them. The sooner one came, the easier it would be for them to find a new master. However, at noon on this day, the gates of Chuck City were wide open. The walls were empty and the vassal soldiers were all hiding in their barracks to warm themselves. There was not even a single person on patrol. The huge city gates were wide open. Naturally, there was no one to clean up the snow on the roads. In the distance outside the city gates, the silhouettes of a group of mounted soldiers could be seen in the snow. The silhouettes of the mounted soldiers in the distance numbered no more than 10. According to Byzantium's military system, it was only a small group. Those mounted soldiers were all wearing leather jackets with leather armor on the outside. Hanging from their saddles were the standard cavalry lances of the Byzantine army. A small group of cavalrymen came from the north. When they were not far away from the city, the cavalrymen at the front calmly raised a military flag. When this small cavalry squad arrived at the foot of the city wall, there were a few surrendered soldiers who came out to collect snow to boil water. When they finally saw them from afar, they were shocked. Immediately, they screamed and ran away in the wind. They even threw away the basins in their hands that were used to collect snow. When the group of mounted soldiers entered the city, the surrendered soldiers in the city were all alarmed. More than 2,000 surrendered soldiers were holed up in Odin's barrack. They did not even dare to close the barrack. 2,000 people were holed up in the barrack. They gathered there and did not even dare to breathe. Only a few officers of the surrendered soldiers were gathered in a tent. They looked at each other in dismay, unable to make a decision. After waiting for a long time, they secretly sent their trusted subordinates to observe the situation outside the barrack. However, they did not see the group of Byzantium mounted soldiers coming into the city. They only heard that after the cavalry entered the city, they went straight to the warehouse and patrolled around the city. Finally, after 2 hours of entering the city, they finally arrived at the barracks entrance. The surrendered soldiers who were observing the situation outside the barracks hurriedly ran in. How would they dare to stand at the entrance and peek? Kill? Surrender? Defend? These officers were not decisive people. After being bullied by Odin's men for so many days, even if they had some backbone, their spines would have long been broken. How would they have any courage left? Time seemed to pass very slowly. Only when the people in the barracks were about to go crazy with anxiety did a bugle call come from outside. When the Byzantium bugle call came into the ears of the surrendered soldiers, they were first shocked. Then, they heaved a sigh of relief. Luckily, it wasn't the bugle call to attack. Everyone was used to the Byzantium bugle call and could tell that it was the rhythm of the bugle call. Then, the sound of hooves could be heard from outside. 2 mounted soldiers charged into the barrack. The officers in the tents could hear the shouts of the cavalry outside. General's orders. Assemble the entire barracks. Listen to General's orders. In less than an hour, the entire barracks will be executed. General's orders. General's orders. General's orders. The 2 mounted soldiers circled the barracks 3 times and shouted more than 10 times before galloping out of the barracks. The surrendered soldiers in the barracks were suspicious. They discussed with each other for a while. Not to mention anything else, just the address of general made them nervous. The rank of a general? Could it be a high official of Byzantium? Although they were suspicious, they didn't have the courage to resist. After hesitating for a while, the surrendered soldiers came out of the barracks and gathered the people of each barrack. They hastily lined up and huddled together in the barrack. Then, they elected 2 braver soldiers to go out of the barracks to welcome the incoming soldiers. Finally, after a while, the dozen or so mounted soldiers entered the barracks. The 2,000 surrendered soldiers were a little scattered. They allowed the dozen or so mounted soldiers to slowly walk past them. The soldiers didn't even dare to breathe loudly. After all, the strength of the Byzantium cavalry a few days ago was really frightening. Even the fierce Odin couldn't withstand a single blow from them, not to mention the defeated soldiers of Odin. No matter what, they had been nervous for many days. Since the Byzantium cavalry had come to reclaim the city, everything was fine. Even if they were recruited, it was still better than having nothing to look forward to every day. The few cowardly officers in the surrendered soldiers lowered their heads. They didn't even dare to look at the mounted soldiers. 1 or 2 braver ones only dared to raise their heads slightly and peek out of the corner of their eyes. The dozen or so cavalrymen circled around the formation and slowly came to the front of the camp. However, they did not dismount from their horses. Instead, they lined up in a straight line. Among the dozen or so cavalrymen, one of the cavalrymen slowly took a few steps forward. A cavalryman wearing leather armor on the back of the horse swept a gloomy gaze across the entire field of soldiers who were panicking like stray dogs. He secretly sighed softly. "Everyone, raise your heads." A frosty voice echoed throughout the entire place amidst the chilly wind. After a short moment of silence, 2 of the surrendered soldiers, standing at the front of the formation, suddenly exclaimed in a low voice, "Sir! Sir Sogol? It's Sir Sogol. General Sogol." The general who entered the city was naturally the last general of the Corsica military, Sogol, whom Shea had subdued. As the last remaining general of the Corsica military and a highly respected figure in the Corsica military, Shea had spent a lot of effort and thought to subdue General Sogol. In order to get Sogol, Shea had even given up the Corsica military governor's successor, Gaia. With such a useful person in his hands, how could Shea not make full use of him? In this plan, Shea led 800 cavalrymen straight into Ilton County. He didn't recruit any of the surrendered soldiers along the way. It wasn't that Shea wasn't interested in the surrendered soldiers. It was just that his cavalry relied on speed and surprise attacks. He didn't have the luxury of time to recruit any soldiers. As a supplement to the plan, General Sogol was ordered by Shea to follow the attack route of Shea's cavalrymen and recruit the surrendered soldiers along the way for Shea to use. Sogol was originally a high-ranking general of the Corsica military and was highly respected. Most of the vassals of the Odins were Corsica's surrendered troops. There were more than 2,000 of them, and their leader was an emblem regimental officer. He could barely be considered a senior officer. In the past, he had seen a real senior general like Sogol in the Corsica military region. Although the others didn't recognize Sogol's appearance, they had heard of his name. As the person to recruit these surrendered soldiers, Sogol was the best candidate. He used to be a member of the Corsica military region, so he was familiar with the situation of the Corsica military region and had prestige. From Shea's point of view, Sogol was an upright person with no personal ambitions. Since he had pledged allegiance to Shea and pinned his hopes of revenge on Shea, Shea didn't have to worry about Sogol's disloyalty. Sure enough, when the name Sogol was shouted, a commotion immediately broke out in the group of surrendered soldiers who were originally as quiet as cicadas in winter. Many of the surrendered soldiers and officers who were originally fearful or numb immediately showed signs of liveliness and hope when they heard the name. In particular, many of them seemed to have heaved a sigh of relief. Seeing the sudden commotion in the group, Sogol's gaze turned complicated. However, this complicated gaze immediately turned cold and hard. Silence! He took a deep breath and suddenly shouted. His sharp gaze swept across the few officers standing at the front. He shouted, "What's the meaning of this loud commotion in the army? If there's any more noise, drag them out and behead them." As soon as he gave the order, the dozen or so cavalrymen beside him immediately raised their lances and pointed the tips of the lances at the surrendered soldiers in front of them. The gleaming lances emitted a cold light. Truth be told, if there was any chaos, even if these 2,000 surrendered soldiers had no backbone and courage, they would not be able to be suppressed by a mere dozen or so cavalrymen. 2,000 against a dozen people, there was no need to fight. If they were to swarm forward, they would be able to crush them to death. However, the deterrence of Shea's cavalrymen from a few days ago was still present. The moment they saw that the situation was not right, the surrendered soldiers immediately stopped their clamor and became quiet again. They only looked at Sogol and the others in front of them in fear. Even the formation had quietly moved back. Sogol gave a cold snort and his face was filled with anger. "Look at you all. You were all honorable soldiers. But now all I see is a pile of mud." He exhaled and raised his hand to point at the few officers in the front row. "The few of you speak. The rest of you, shut up." The few officers who were pointed at looked at each other. Finally, one of them who appeared to be the one with the highest position stepped forward and saluted. He then said in a respectful tone, "Lord Screen Elder." Sogol's face sank when he heard this address. When he was in the Corsica military region, he was the Screen Elder. As a military supporter of the governor's eldest son, the Screen Elder was considered one of the top figures in the Corsica military region. However, at this moment, this officer who was obviously a veteran of the Corsica military region called out this address in hopes that Sogol would remember their old friendship. However, Sogol's expression changed abruptly. He interrupted the other party and snorted. "Don't mention the old address." He paused and slowly said, "I am now under the command of Marshal Shea of the Empire's Northern Theater of Operations. I am the General of the Northern Theater of Operations 3rd Division. All of you can just call me Lord General. Don't mention the old address." The surrendered officer was still somewhat quick-witted. He immediately changed his address. "Yes, Lord General." Sogol's expression softened a little. He then said in a deep voice, "How many people are in your battalion? How many combat soldiers and auxiliary soldiers? Give me a detailed report." The officer's face was a little bitter, but he still replied respectfully, "My lord, the current number of auxiliary soldiers in the city is 2,336. We were previously under Odin. Those Odin barbarians don't know anything about military systems. After we were incorporated, there was no distinction between combat soldiers and auxiliary soldiers. We were all grouped into one battalion. However, there are still 2,015 people in the battalion, and all of them are here. A few days ago, after the city was breached, there were some deserters in the city. The rest are here." Sogol sneered. "Deserters? Humph, the city has been breached for many days, and there is no one to control you. Why don't you all run?" The officer replied honestly, "The Byzantine army that breached the city confiscated all the horses and livestock in the city. Those that could be taken away were taken away, and those that couldn't were slaughtered. in this world of ice and snow, and the Odin's people had caused Ilton County to be sparsely populated. If we ran out of the city without horses, we would freeze or starve to death in less than 2 days. It's not that we don't want to run, but we don't dare to. Sorgel nodded and glanced at the officer. You're telling the truth. He paused for a moment and then said in a deep voice, Since the city was breached by the Imperial Army, I am here under orders to take it back. If you are willing to surrender, I will take you in as my subordinates. If you aren't willing, HMPF, my Northern War Zone's army will soon head south and 8,000 cavalrymen will sweep over. If someone wants to throw their life away for Odin, I'll let them throw their lives away. It was true that Sogel was lying, but the number of 8,000 cavalry was enough to scare these people. A few days ago, only a few hundred cavalrymen had slaughtered thousands of Odin's people in a single charge. If there were 8,000 in any case, these surrendered soldiers had no intention of resisting. As for working for Odin's people, that was even more impossible. When the officer heard this, he immediately knelt down on one knee and shouted loudly, We are willing to surrender to you, sir. After he took the lead, the other officers behind him quickly followed suit. The soldiers behind them also followed suit. In a short time, the entire army had knelt down. Sogel's expression was calm as he said slowly, Since you have surrendered, I will not torture my own soldiers like Odin's barbarians. From today onwards, the 2,000 of you will be temporarily organized into a banner. He then pointed at the leading officer. You will also temporarily take up the position of the banner bearer. The officer's face lit up. Then, he heard Sogel shout in a deep voice, Since you have been organized into the 3rd Corps of the Northern War Zone, you will naturally be subject to the Empire's military law. I am not as easy to fool as those Odin's barbarians. The military law in my army is very strict. If anyone disobeys my orders, I will not take into account our old friendship. As for you, he continued to point at the officer, do your job well. Our marshal is fair in his rewards and punishments. If you do well, you will have a bright future. If you don't. At this point, he did not say much and only laughed coldly. That was enough to make those fellows break out in cold sweat. Without using his sword or spear, Sogel calmly subdued this small city and incorporated the 2,000 surrendered soldiers into his army. His so-called title of 3rd Corps of the Northern War Zone was not fake. Before Shea set off, he had appointed Sogel to this position. However, this 3rd Corps only existed on paper. Sogel was the general leading the army. However, he only had a dozen or so soldiers under his command. As for rations, supplies, armors, and other military equipment, he did not even have a shadow of them. Shea's plan was to go on an expedition while Sogel would slowly follow behind and incorporate the surrendered soldiers into his army. As for this 3rd Corps of the Northern War Zone, Shea had the idea of gaining something without risking anything. This kind of calculation was considered smart. Anyway, in Shea's plan, if it succeeded, with Sogel's prestige in the Corsica military region, he would be able to recruit the surrendered soldiers. If it went well, he would gain a corps out of thin air. If he reorganized it well in the future, it might be useful. After all, the Corsica military region used to be a powerful military region. The surrendered soldiers of Corsica were actually of good quality. However, after they lost the war, their homes were annexed, and they were incorporated into the Odin's army. Therefore, after some reorganization, they were still useful. Taking 10,000 steps back, even if it fails, Shea didn't invest any capital anyway, so he won't lose anything. Sogel only stayed in the city for half a day. Then, he left less than 500 men to guard the city and ordered the rest of the surrendered soldiers to assemble. He then personally led his men out of the city and headed south, following the route that Shea's army had previously marched. The few strongholds in front had already been wiped out by Shea. In the city, there were still surrendered soldiers waiting for Sogol to incorporate. After Manninger's great victory, he was extremely arrogant. He incorporated all the Corsican troops into his army and did not dare to stay in Corsica. After all, Manninger was afraid that the troops would cause trouble if they stayed in their homeland. Instead, most of them were scattered and distributed in Ilton County. According to Shea and Sogol's calculations, there were probably more than 20,000 to 30,000 surrendered soldiers in all parts of Ilton County. If he continued to incorporate them, it would be like a rolling snowball. Although his force was weak at first, once he could gather more than 10,000 people, his momentum would naturally be different. At that time, with Sogol's prestige and Shea's cavalry as a deterrent, he might become a force qualified to influence the war. Sogol was following Shea's plan to incorporate one city after another behind him. Meanwhile, in the capital city of Ilton County, New City, Shea's cavalry had already entered the city. The battle had ended long ago. Although Morka had left 500 Odin soldiers in the city when he went out to battle, the battle had been defeated. Shea's cavalry had broken into the city, and the leader of the city, Manninger's eldest son Morka, had been personally killed by Shea at the city gate. Such awe-inspiring power had already sent chills down the spines of the remaining defenders in the city. Shea's entire army slaughtered their way into the city. Odin's men in the city no longer had the will to defend to the death. A small number of Odin's men who were conceited and brave tried to fight to the death, but they were also crushed in an instant. More than 100 Odin's men rode on their reindeer and fled in panic through another city gate. Odin's men did not fight in the streets to defend the city, which left Shea with a lot of strength. The cavalry under his command entered the city and easily swept away the resistance. After the melee, there were also 100 or so Odin's men who were injured and captured. These were the most elite warriors of the Scarlet Snow Army. But for these captives, Shea wasn't even interested in looking at them. Cut off their legs, strip them naked and throw them into the snow outside the city gate. Shea's voice was cold and his eyes were murderous. Don't these Odin's men always think that they are not afraid of the cold? Just throw them outside the city and let them freeze for a night. Send someone to check on them tomorrow. If they are still alive, capture them and interrogate them. His order was equivalent to cutting off the lives of those Odin's captives. Even though the Odin's men were born in the north and could withstand the cold, in such a cold winter, cutting off their legs, stripping their clothes and throwing them outside the city, injuring and bleeding, plus being naked in the snow for a night, even the strongest Odin's men would freeze to death. As for, if they are still alive, there was no possibility at all. With Shea's order, the cavalry under his command naturally carried it out without hesitation. In a moment, those captives were stripped naked and thrown outside the city. Everyone's legs were cut off. On the snowy ground outside the city gate, there were more than 100 naked bodies with their legs cut off. The ground was covered in blood. More than 100 Odin's men were struggling in the snow. Those who were more strong-willed were cursing loudly, while those who were more miserable were wailing in pain. For a moment, the auxiliary troops on and below the city gate were all frightened and their expressions changed. Shea even went up the city wall and stood there to watch coldly. After watching for a while, Nei, who was standing beside him, finally could not help but sigh. She whispered, "Shea, isn't this too much?" Nei's eyes were a little unbearable. She frowned and said, "It's okay to die on the battlefield. Even if you don't want to spare these captives, you can just kill them with one slash. Why torture them like this?" Shea glanced at Nei. He stared at Nei for a long time before letting out a soft sigh. Shea's solemn voice softly fell into Nei's ears. "It's not that I'm cruel or bloodthirsty. It's just that we don't have that many people. There are more than 2,000 auxiliary troops and surrendered soldiers in the city. This is Manninger's base. He has been running this place for more than half a year. The surrendered soldiers here are the ones he has the best control over. He has also placed some of his trusted subordinates here. We are the guest army. Although today's battle has shocked them, it's inevitable that some of them will harbor ill intentions. The reason why I'm doing this is not for anything else but to establish our might. To let these Odin's elites, who used to be high and mighty, struggle and cry in the snow right under their noses. To let those surrendered soldiers in the city understand, those who dare to go against us will have to face such a cruel punishment. Although our journey to the south has been quite smooth, even now, we are still walking on a tightrope. Normally, there are many ways to subdue the hearts of the people. Other than deterrence, there are also ways to appease them. But right now, I don't have that much time to patiently appease them and subdue them. In such a short time, I can only establish my might through killing, using blood to intimidate them. As he spoke, Shea quietly pointed at some of the officers of the surrendered soldiers on the city walls. Look at their faces. Nay's heart skipped a beat. He turned around to look. Sure enough, those officers of the surrendered soldiers were looking at the wailing soldiers in the snow below the city walls. Their faces were pale and their eyes were filled with fear. Nei finally let out a sigh. Although he still couldn't bear it, he had to admit that Shea's method was indeed effective. Shea slowly took in a breath and looked at Nei again. When we entered the city, there were more than 100 Odin's men who fled from the side gate. I didn't let you chase after them because I deliberately left them alive. The survivors must have rushed to the front without stopping to report to Manning about what had happened here. He sneered and said in a low voice, "Once Manninger hears that his lair has been raided by me and that his son has been killed by me, with his temper, he will definitely return with his entire army. At that time, the siege of Grimm's troops will naturally be resolved. But here we have to face Manninger's monstrous wrath. His subordinates are all the elites of the Scarlet Snow Army. With the pain of losing his son, I'm afraid that he will kill us at all costs. Although our few hundred riders are good at fighting, if we encounter a large army of tens of thousands of people, it's still not enough. Just wait and see, the battle a few days ago was just an appetizer. Next, under this new city, there will be a great battle." As Shea spoke, his gaze became sharper. He raised his head and raised his right hand to the sky, then clenched it tightly. "I want to settle the situation in the north in one battle under this new city. I want the Scarlet Snow Army to not return to the north. The Scarlet Snow Army is the army of the Bashak tribe, one of the 5 major tribes of the Odin. Since they dared to come to the south this time, I want to add tens of thousands of orphans and widows to their Bashak tribe. I want the Bashak tribe to not have the slightest thought of looking south for generations." Looking at Shea and listening to Shea's cold voice, Nay's heart could not help but sink. She only felt that the Shea in front of her seemed to have become somewhat different from before. She could not help but recall the scene at the end of the previous battle, when Shea suddenly unleashed his invincible power and killed Morko with his own hands. Then, he broke into the city alone and smashed the city gate in one fell swoop. At that time, his invincible power was still vivid in her mind at this moment. He was originally so weak, but why did he suddenly seem to unleash such an invincible power in these few days? As if he felt Nay's strange gaze, Shea lowered his head and exhaled. Then, he raised his eyes to look at the miserable cries below the city. Since it has been broken, there are no more restrictions. It doesn't matter if it's a massacre or a cruel one, in this battle, there is no mercy. Either I die or they die, there is no leeway at all. Today, you may say that I am cruel, but if I fail, the ones lying in the snow below the city right now will be me, Shea, and the people under my command. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 465. There was an accident during the writing process. As a result, I had to delete a section and rewrite it. I rushed to finish it and it was already 12 o'clock. I won't stop updating. It's just that some of the readers have asked me to set a fixed time for updating. This is a bit difficult to do. Firstly, writing a novel relies on feelings and inspiration. The speed of writing is really not like the speed of a train or a plane that can be punctual. Secondly, I still have matters to attend to at home, please forgive me. I will first resume updating daily. As for the rest, I will gradually improve it in the future. GOR Chapter 433 Breaking Out of the Cage. 5. You are dismissed. Grimm rubbed his forehead that was faintly aching. His face was calm as he shouted in a low voice. The young officer standing in front of him straightened his body and performed a military salute. Then, he turned around and walked out of the tent with his head held high. When the curtain of the tent was lifted, a gust of cold wind rushed in from outside. Green could not help but shiver. The wind was not as cold as he had imagined. However, Green's heart had turned cold. The officer just now was the logistical officer of the army. The chief logistical officer of the entire Moore County was Ka Tua, who was known as the smuggler in the army. The logistical system of the army was controlled by Ka Tua. The northern military region had not been established for long. The logistical officers of the army were all recruited and selected by Ka Tua. Under the influence of Ka Tua, each and every one of them had the same temperament as Ka Tua, cunning with a bit of ruthlessness. Green had never interfered too much with the logistical system. On one hand, Ka Tua's character and loyalty to Shea need not be overstated. Given Ka Tua's shrewdness and loyalty, Green felt relieved to hand over the logistical system to him. On the other hand, as Shea's family and this small group of people grew bit by bit, Green, who was an old soldier in the army, naturally had his own understanding. He was well aware that in Shea's small group, his prestige and experience were second only to Shea. To put it bluntly, if one were to look purely at experience, Green's nickname was Mad Dog. He was a well-known figure in the Empire's military for many years. He was also a legitimate graduate of the Imperial Military Academy. He was from the first faction in the military, the Eagle Branch. He was the direct disciple of the old Duke, Lord Minas. He had fame, background, and connections. Given Grimm's status, if he were to be placed in a chaotic world like this, it would be a time when the Empire needed people. He would be qualified to assume the position of a commander. Shea had only been in the army for a short time, but Green had wisely begun to avoid arousing suspicion. Although he knew that Shea would not suspect him, in this small group, others might not think so. In order to consolidate the stability of this small group, it was necessary to establish Shea's authority and core position. If he interfered too much, it was inevitable that he would be criticized behind his back. Therefore, when it came to such an important matter as military supplies, Green almost always left Shea to Ka Tua to manage. He would not casually interfere in such matters. For this expedition, the accompanying military supplies were all arranged by Ka Tua. Green did not assign any of his own trusted subordinate. This way of doing things, it maintained the stability of this small group in Moore County, and at the same time, it also made those who had other thoughts to give up. After all, Shea's experience was still a little too young, and he had also swallowed up the remnants of the 6th and 7th Corps, and those two corps had no lack of veterans in the army. Although they had no choice but to comply at the time, but after a long time, under the command of a rookie in the army like Shea, it was inevitable that some of them would have other thoughts in their hearts. Not to mention anything else, when Shea was in Denzel City for many days, there were people who secretly came to Green and vaguely expressed their intentions. They hoped that Green would seize the opportunity to seize power and even replace him. In the hearts of these veterans, Green was still someone who had the qualifications to be a commander. After all, the Mad Dog's reputation and experience were there for all to see. As for Shea, he was really too inexperienced. Fortunately, Green was a straightforward person. He did not pay attention to these undercurrents in the dark. Instead, he simply let go of power and made a good show of it. Only then did some restlessness gradually calm down. Although Green was somewhat dissatisfied with this expedition, at least in front of others, he didn't openly question Shea's orders. For any army, if the majesty of the commander-in-chief can't be guaranteed, then no matter how well equipped the army was, it would still be in a state of disunity. Since the expedition to the south, Green had kept in mind the plan he had discussed with Shea. He would bring this main force south, one camp at a time, and fight steadily and surely. To put it bluntly, this kind of attitude did not resemble an expedition at all. It was more like a low-key and passive withdrawal of troops. The army moved forward slowly, shrinking into a ball. It was extremely stable, and did not make any risky moves. Even if there were Odin's small army along the way that tried to intercept and provoke them repeatedly, Green would only pretend that he did not see it. The army moved slowly south, step by step, carefully entering the trap that Manning had set up. But today, Green's heart really could not hold back anymore. When marching to war, there were times when one had to take risks. How could Green not understand this principle? But the problem was that the current situation was really extremely dangerous. Manning had mobilized the garrisons in various places to intercept them. Odin's elites had gathered, and the old foundation of the Scarlet Snow Army had been pulled out by Manning. This Odin was a hero and full of ambition. He had made up his mind to swallow this Byzantine army that had intruded into his territory in one bite. This was the last resistance force in the north, flattening the situation in the north in one fell swoop, completely taking control of the overall situation. At this moment, entrenched around Green's lone army were tens of thousands of Scarlet Snow Army's elites personally led by Manning. Thousands of Odin's reindeer cavalry roamed around the two flanks. There was even a Scarlet Snow army of tens of thousands behind Green, cutting off the retreat route of Green's army. In addition, Green's troops were now hundreds of miles deep into the Siltenran County. Being alone outside, there was naturally no way to replenish their supplies and provisions. There were covetous gazes all around them. The army could still move forward slowly before, but 2 days ago, they finally could not move forward anymore. Manning had finally dug a hole in this trap. They could neither advance nor retreat. Just now, the logistics officer in the army came to report to Green that the army's provisions were almost depleted. The provisions of the people could still last for a few more days. After all, if the soldiers ate less, they could still delay for a few more days. But there was not enough fodder for the war horses. Originally, when the army set out for the expedition, they did not bring much supplies. According to Shea's plan, the provisions that they brought along would only last for half a month. No matter how frugal Green was, by today, this little bit of stock was almost used up. Manning was also considered cunning. He had already tied up his pockets and had entered the trap, but the other party was not in a hurry to attack. Instead, they surrounded the area and waited quietly. Thinking about it, this hero Odin must have calculated that this lone army of his would not be able to bring along much provisions in the enemy's territory. If this continued, when his army ran out of provisions, the morale of the army would definitely be unstable. At that time, he would swarm forward, and naturally, it would be twice the result with half the effort. Just now, when the logistics officer in the army reported to him, Green was already clear that if there were no changes in the next 3 days, then this lone army of his would be doomed. In fact, since yesterday, the soldiers in the army had already been reduced to 70% of the standard ration every day. But just now, that logistics officer had taken the initiative to propose a solution. This suggestion made Green somewhat flabbergasted. What kind of subordinates did that smuggler Ka Toa cultivate in the end? That officer looked a little too young. Although he stood up straight, in the eyes of an experienced soldier like Green, his military posture was still somewhat immature. But it just so happened that such a young officer who looked like a rookie actually came up with an idea that made Green jump in fright. "Sir, if this matter cannot be done, I have a way to temporarily slow down the morale of the army due to the lack of provisions. Sir, you only need to arrest me in front of the entire army and then order me to be executed according to military law. You only need to announce to the entire army that it was me, a logistics officer, who embezzled the military equipment and provisions, which led to the shortage of provisions. This way, the panic of the soldiers due to the lack of provisions will turn into resentment toward me. Although this method cannot eradicate the current predicament, it can at least delay for 2 days for Sir." When that young officer said these words in a firm and even somewhat cold tone, even Green was somewhat moved. Such a ruthless heart. Where did Shea find such a young man? He asked and found out that this young logistics officer was named Kevin. He was a young man from a broken family who had been conveniently rescued by Shea from Odin's people in the south during one of his previous excursions. Because he was quite good at planning, he was ultimately taken by Ka-Tua to be used by his subordinate. The method that Kevin proposed was extremely cruel and callous. It was as if he didn't care about his own life at all. But how could Green really use this method? After a few words of reprimand, he sent the logistics officer out. There was only so much food left in the army. If Shea didn't make any progress later, the 10,000 people he brought would really have no road to heaven and no door to hell. Just as Green was racking his brains to come up with a countermeasure and worrying about his own situation, Manninger, on the other hand, was in high spirits. It was as if he had seen the most glorious moment of his life. Ever since the Scarlet Snow Army went south, other than a small setback at the beginning, they had been irresistible. They had completely annihilated the main force of the Byzantine Empire's 7th Division. This had greatly boosted Manninger's reputation. In that battle, they had taken down a division of the Central Army of the Byzantine Empire. Such an outstanding military achievement, in the Odin Empire, could only be achieved by the war god Hastings, who was known as the Odin's #1 general. After this achievement of Manninger's spread to the country, it was said that it had caused a stir among the 5 major tribes. The Scarlet Snow Army could be said to have become famous in one battle. Manninger himself was different from the ordinary Odin tribe leaders. He was ambitious and was good at scheming. Whether it was knowledge or breadth of mind, it was not something that the other barbaric Odin people could compare to. He was very clear about the situation in the Odin Empire. Under the Odin Emperor, the 5 major tribes were not subordinate to each other. Only the existence of a powerful figure like the Emperor could suppress the other tribes and make them submit to him. He, Manninger, had always firmly clung to the Emperor's thigh. It was even more likely that his family and the royal family would become in-laws. It could be said that as long as the current Emperor Odin was on the throne, there would not be any problems with the power of Manninger and the Bashak tribe. But Manninger was thinking even further. What he wanted was not only the power and wealth of this generation of his own tribe. What he wanted was for the Bashak to be able to enjoy power and wealth for generations. He wanted to stand in the core of the Odin Empire's power and not fall. In addition to being closely aligned with the royal family, Manninger wholeheartedly wanted to take advantage of this opportunity when the Odin Empire invaded the south to occupy a vast and rich land for his tribe to live in, so that the future generations of his tribe could have a peaceful foundation. The land in the northern part of the Byzantine Empire was rich in grain production. The climate was also relatively suitable for the Odin people to adapt to. Manninger did not only want to loot and plunder the Odin Empire's previous war model. Manninger had always disdained the previous war model of the Odin Empire. In his view, it was nothing more than a war of bandits. Although it looked glorious for a while, no matter how much money and slaves they robbed, how could it be more valuable than land? Only by truly occupying the land of the Byzantine Empire, and turning the Byzantium people on this land into slaves of his own tribe, generation after generation, letting his tribe take root in this land and firmly guard this land, was the greatest capital for the Bashak tribe to prosper in the future. Even after several generations, even if the tribe was no longer favored by the emperor, as long as they had such a large piece of land and countless slaves in their hands, the Bashak tribe's prosperity would not be a problem at all. Since going down south, they had first annihilated the 7th Division of the Byzantine Empire, then occupied the entire Ilton prefecture. Then, they had marched east and annexed the Corsica military district. With the land of these two prefectures in their hands, the land they had conquered had already exceeded the land area of Maninger's tribe in the country. And the population of these two prefectures had far exceeded the population of Maninger's tribe. He had already worked hard for more than half a year, driving the slaves, building new settlements, and making preparations for the migration of his tribe. Once the winter was over and the roads were cleared, they would be able to migrate a large number of people from within the country to live here. After a few years, they would be able to gain a firm foothold, and this piece of land would completely belong to their own clan. This was capital in his hands. He even had the occasional impulse in his heart, and couldn't help but daydream. If there were any changes in the Odin Empire 100 years later, if the royal family was weak, as long as his Bashak tribe had such valiant strength, it might not be impossible for them to strive for the peak of power. Who knew what would happen in the future? Everything he had done today was to lay a solid foundation for the future prosperity of his clan. In Maninger's view, the only stumbling block in front of him now was the small resistance force entrenched in Moor Prefecture behind him. Before winter, he had sent his son Morka to go on an expedition, but he had suffered a small loss. Although Maninger was shocked and angry, he didn't really care too much. After all, in his view, it was just a bunch of motley crew. His Odin elites had only made a mistake due to a moment of carelessness. Although he was a little disappointed by his son's incompetence, as long as he waited until spring, when he had gathered enough provisions and led the army into battle, he would naturally be able to wipe out the motley crew. At that time, he would have tens of thousands of soldiers in his hands, and tens of thousands of vassals and surrendered troops. He would have control over Moor Prefecture, Ilton Prefecture, and Corsica Prefecture, the three largest grain-producing regions in the north of the Byzantine Empire. He would have thousands of miles of land and millions of people. When that day came, even the mighty Emperor Odin would have to look up to him. Of the 5 major tribes in the Odin Empire, his Bashak tribe might not be able to compete with the royal family, but it was enough to be above the other tribes. Life was like this. The greatest achievement of his life was right in front of him. How could Maninger not be happy and unrestrained in such a situation? But even with such a great future right in front of him, Maninger still reminded himself to be cautious at all times. Now that his army had set up a trap and had surrounded the lone army in front of him, he still did not give the order to launch a general attack immediately. Instead, he restrained the impulse in his heart and continued to wait patiently. He had to wait. When the enemy's provisions ran out and their morale was in chaos, then he would defeat the enemy in one fell swoop. After leading the army for so many years, Maninger had also calculated that the enemy would send a small group of troops to the hinterland of his territory to cause trouble and attract his attention. But under his arrangements, in the territory of Ilton Prefecture, there were small groups of Odin army stationed in every important town. A small number of Scarlet Snow army and a certain number of surrendered vassals. Even if a small group of enemy troops came in to cause trouble, the forces he had left behind would be enough to deal with it. And in his old nest, New City, he left his son Morka, 2,000 of his most elite warriors, and thousands of surrendered vassals. Even if there were tens of thousands of Byzantine army attacking the city, it would be enough to deal with it. No matter how Manninger calculated, he felt that the situation in front of him was foolproof. These small enemies under his command would never have a chance to cause trouble again. He led these 10,000 elites and blocked the front of Grimm's army, waiting day after day. Manninger's mind was anxious from waiting, but in his heart, he was certain that the enemy would be weakened by one more day if he waited. After waiting patiently for so long, the day was finally about to pass. In the evening, he ran out of his tent and patrolled the camp. The military system of Odin's people had always been rough. As a commander, he patrolled everywhere, but it was not as strict as the Byzantine army. Wherever he went, the soldiers only saluted respectfully and did not stop what they were doing. They did what they were supposed to do and ate what they were supposed to eat. There were even Odin's brave warriors in the army who took off their clothes to fight for fun when they had nothing to do. This was a common scene in Odin's army. Manninger patrolled the camp once, then personally ran to the front of the camp and looked into the distance from the hastily built watchtower. The Byzantine army in the distance was still motionless. Is their morale low? Or has the enemy's commander resigned to his fate? But what made Manninger a little uncomfortable was that there were still wisps of smoke coming from the Byzantium camp opposite him. Just by looking at the smoke, he knew that the enemy had not run out of food. Looks like I have to wait for another 2 days. Manninger sighed in his heart. Although he was impulsive, he was a cunning old fox. The more critical the moment, the more he reminded himself to calm down. After looking for a while, Manninger snorted and walked down the watchtower. Just as he was about to return to his tent, he suddenly stopped after taking 2 steps. His eyes flashed, and he suddenly turned around and climbed back up the watchtower to look into the distance. A moment later, a carefree and proud smile appeared on his face. Ha ha ha! Looks like the commander of this Byzantine army has some ability. I was almost fooled by him. Hee hee. He laughed heartily, and his brows, which had been tightly knitted for the past few days, finally relaxed. As the commander-in-chief and chief of the clan, Manning naturally had other generals and subordinates by his side. Someone asked, "Chief, why are you laughing like that?" Manninger laughed proudly and pointed at the Byzantine army camp in the distance. He shouted, "Do you see the smoke? 3 times a day, morning, noon, and night, there will be smoke coming from the chimneys. Previously, I was fooled by the commander of the Byzantine army. When I saw the smoke, I thought that they still had some food to use, so I naturally couldn't attack immediately. But now I've seen through his trick." After a pause, he pointed into the distance. "Do you see anything strange with the smoke?" These subordinates beside him were all rough Odin men. They stared at the smoke for a long time, but how could they see anything? Manninger sighed in his heart. After all, although the generals and leaders beside him were brave, in terms of brains, they were. He laughed bitterly. Perhaps this was destined. The heavens gave the Odin men strength and bravery, but they were lacking in coarseness and recklessness. There were very few Odin men who were willing to use their brains like him. However, this thought only lasted for a moment before Manninger sneered. "These days there has been smoke coming from the chimneys on the other side every day, but today I've seen through it. Look carefully. If it was real smoke, the smoke would definitely be thin and thin. But look at the smoke on the other side, it's black and thick. How is this smoke? It's clearly the smoke from the burning of firewood by the Byzantine army. They're using it to trick me. The Byzantine army must have been short of food for a long time. It's just that the enemy commander was afraid that I would take the opportunity to attack, so he ordered the soldiers to cut down firewood and use the smoke to pretend to be smoke. This kind of plan can be considered as him putting in a lot of effort. I've been fooled for a few days, and since I've seen through it today, I naturally won't continue to sit by and watch." The more he spoke, the more agitated he became. He raised his hand and shouted, return to the tent, beat the drums. Leaders of the various camps gather. Today is the day to defeat the enemy. The moment Manninger gave the order, the entire army was shaken. Following the beating of the drums, the leaders of the various camps all rushed towards the commander's tent. Inside the tent, Manninger had been waiting for a long time. By the time all the leaders of his army had gathered, Manninger was already fully clad in his armor. His face was filled with excitement, and he was in high spirits. Looking at the dense crowd in the tent, and seeing that they were all the most valiant warriors of his tribe, Manninger was even more excited. He shouted loudly, "Everyone! After waiting for so many days, I'm sure everyone is anxious. That mere lone army is right under our noses, and we've endured for so many days. Today we're going to take a bite out of this fat piece of meat." In the tent, the roar of agreement was so loud that it almost overturned the tent. The Odin people were good at fighting, and after being held back in this camp for so many days, the soldiers under them had long been impatient. "I agree. Tonight is the night." Manninger's face was flushed red and he was in a good mood. Just as he was about to pass down some kind of order, he suddenly heard a commotion outside the tent. Following that, the tent's curtains were pulled open, and the sound of messy footsteps could be heard. A few of his personal guards escorted a few Odin warriors in a sorry state as they rushed in. The few people who came in were all covered in blood. Their armor was crooked, and some of them didn't even have any weapons. The moment they came in, they stumbled and fell on the ground in front of Manninger. Some of them immediately began to wail loudly. Manninger's voice stopped abruptly. Looking at these few people, he vaguely recognized that they were the leaders of the elite army of his tribe that he had left behind in the new city. His heart instantly sank. You few, why, Manninger's face had already changed. He was about to ask when he suddenly felt short of breath, as if he had a faint premonition in his heart. One of the Odin warriors who had fallen in front of him knocked his head hard on the ground a few times, then got up. Just as he was about to say something, Manninger suddenly shouted, "You, come here and whisper to me." The warrior was stunned for a moment, then he walked in front of Manninger, leaned over, and whispered in Manninger's ear for a moment. Manninger's face, which had been glowing red, turned pale in an instant. The color on his face seemed to have faded away in an instant. The muscles on his face, one by one, began to tremble violently. His eyes were wide open, and his face was filled with malevolence. In the end, his eyes were filled with rage and grief. Finally, he suddenly roared, "It hurts! It hurts so much!" Manninger's eyes were wide open in anger. He raised his leg and kicked the Odin warrior in the abdomen, causing him to fall to the ground. His voice was trembling uncontrollably. You trash! Before I came out, what did I tell you? You still have the face to come see me alive. What's the point of keeping trash like you alive?" He pulled out the long sword at his waist, and with a schwa sound he chopped down. Blood splattered everywhere, and the head of the Odin warrior in front of him immediately rolled out. This sudden turn of events stunned everyone in the tent. It was as if everyone was stunned, and for a long time, no one dared to say a word. Manninger held the long sword in his hand, but his body began to tremble violently. Finally, he swayed, and the sword in his hand fell to the ground. He also sat down on the ground. The personal guards at the side quickly rushed up to support him on both sides. Only then did they manage to lift him up and place him on a chair covered with animal skin. Manninger's breath was already weak, his eyes were closed, and his teeth were tightly clenched. This time everyone panicked. Many of the generals and leaders rushed up. Some shouted, some called, some ordered the guards to be summoned, and some rushed out to call for the military wizards to treat him. After being busy for a while, Manningo, who was lying there, let out a faint groan and slowly opened his eyes. Looking at the crowded faces in front of him, Meningo's lips moved. Just as he opened his mouth, he spat out a mouthful of blood with a puff. The blood splattered on his chest and chin, and his beard was also dark red. It was even more frightening. "Leader! Sir!" "Clan leader!" cries rang out in the tent, and Manninger's unfocused eyes finally showed a trace of sobriety. He weakly raised his finger, and his lips moved. Although his voice was soft, everyone finally heard this sentence. "Retreat! Retreat! Gather the entire army and return to the new city." About that, those who voted for the update and wrote 10,000 words are all bad silver. 5555. To be continued. If you want to know what happened, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.